There are nights when history feels alive, when the past hums softly beneath the surface of our present, like a bell ringing far away through mist. In those moments, stories return to us, not as legends carved in stone, but as echoes made of breath and dust. Long before scripture or empire, people pressed their questions into clay. Who shaped the world, and who shaped us? From those first tablets of Mesopotamia to the candlelit halls of medieval orders, a single thread winds through centuries. The search for where divinity ends and humanity begins. What if that thread never broke? What if the tales we inherited of Adam and Eve, of the serpent, of the flood, were not beginnings at all, but translations passed hand to hand through civilizations, like a secret too fragile to own? Tonight, we follow that thread. Through earth and ink, through relic and song, we'll walk the bridge between myth and memory. You're listening to Serene Myths, a quiet place where history drifts at the pace of thought. If the night finds you here, leave a small sign in the comments, your city, your hour, your sky. And if you wish to linger with us in other journeys, you may like or subscribe, but only if the silence feels right to you. Now let the lantern be lit and follow the sound of distant rain as the story begins, where the clay still breathes. The night opens like a curtain drawn across a monastery's hall, faint and trembling. Somewhere far beyond the stone walls, a bell hums once, thin as silver, swallowed by fog. Its echo travels through damp corridors where the air smells of parchment and wax, and each step leaves a soft impression on dust older than memory. It is in a room like this, low lit and murmuring with the breath of sleeping manuscripts, that the first traces of our story wait, inscribed not on paper, but pressed into clay. Imagine a small lamp sputtering over a wooden table. The archaeologist leans forward, his shadow bending like a pilgrim toward prayer. Before him lies a tablet, no bigger than his palm, etched with wedge-shaped strokes. Cuneiform, the language of Mesopotamia. When light grazes the surface, those tiny marks seem to pulse. In their shallow grooves, there is the rhythm of beginnings, the tremor of a civilization teaching itself to speak. What he does not yet realize is that within these tablets sleeps the oldest form of a story that will later be told in gardens, in temples, in pulpits. The story of a man, a woman, a tree, and a whispering serpent. The clay smells faintly of rain and iron. Each mark was once made by a reed stylus dipped in time. The script tells of gods who sculpted order out of chaos, of waters divided and mountains born, of a struggle between light and shadow. And in one tablet, the Enuma Elish, there is a goddess named Tiamat, embodiment of the wild sea, whose name rolls with the same rhythm as another word that will appear millennia later in Hebrew, tehom, the deep. Between those two sounds lies an entire ocean of meaning. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps inheritance. The archaeologist only exhales and lets the candle flicker over the shapes, as though truth itself were inhaling and exhaling with him. In another crate, there are tablets that speak of a garden watered by 4 rivers, of creatures moulded from the earth's flesh, of a god breathing life through nostrils of clay. One of them names the first man Adamu. The edges of the tablet crumble slightly as he reads it aloud, the syllables dry and ancient. Adamu. The word lingers in the room like dust caught in a shaft of lamplight. Somewhere inside that fragile sound lives a strange familiarity, a bridge stretching across thousands of years toward Adam, a name the world knows by heart. Yet here it is, written long before any scripture of Eden. He lifts another fragment, a depiction of serpents coiled around a tree trunk, their bodies rendered in neat relief. The figures are too stylized to tell whether they charm or threaten, but their presence beside the garden script cannot be ignored. The archaeologist feels the hush of realization, that quiet tremor scholars know when pattern replaces coincidence. For centuries, these tablets have slept beneath the sands of Iraq, oblivious to the faiths that would later rise upon their imagery. Now the clay exhales dust into the lamplight, and the past speaks, not to contradict belief, but to remind it of its roots in earth and myth. Outside, the night deepens. Fog presses against the window like wool. He notes in his journal that these motifs, creation, paradise, serpent, existed long before Genesis. Yet he writes carefully, his language tempered, that this does not disprove, he murmurs. It only traces. Even truth, he knows, has to tread softly among sacred rooms. The bell tolls again in the distance, gentler this time, as though affirming his restraint. The story these tablets whisper is not one of theft, but of travel. Myths, like merchants, journeyed between rivers and deserts, exchanging symbols, changing tongues. The people who wrote these marks lived in a world of many gods. Their cosmos shimmered with divine quarrels and reconciliations. When later hands reshaped those tales into the single-voice theology of Genesis, something was both lost and refined. The echo of chaos turned into the promise of order. Perhaps that is why the clay still hums softly in its box. It remembers being remade. The archaeologist closes his eyes. He imagines the scribe who once pressed the stylus into wet clay. That hand, darkened by sun and oil, pauses now and then to wipe sweat away, hearing the same wind that today blows across abandoned tells. Each mark is a heartbeat. Each pause, a breath. The room becomes two rooms, one in modern dust, one in ancient heat. The distance between them shrinks until time itself feels like another layer of clay peeled back to reveal the pulse beneath. On the wall behind him hangs a map of Mesopotamia, rivers like veins, cities like freckles of light. Near the top corner, someone has pinned a torn note. Origins are palimpsests. The word feels right. Beneath every story lies another, faint but stubborn. The myth of the garden, of man and woman awakening to knowledge, may have been copied, re-inked, and consecrated anew. But the faint imprint of older hands remains, like a thumbprint beneath varnish. When he steps outside for air, the dawn has not yet come. The horizon glows the colour of cooled bronze. He hears the hum of power lines far away, yet they sound to him like an ancient lyre plucked by unseen fingers. The scent of wet soil rises, perhaps the same scent that once clung to the first clay figures as they dried in the sun. For a moment, he imagines them stirring, not as myth, but as metaphor. Humanity shaping itself from dust again and again, each culture breathing new life into old forms. He returns inside and seals the tablet in linen, as one might swaddle a relic or a child. His notes end with a single sentence. The story of Adam and Eve began long before Eden had a name. Then he sets his pen down and listens. The silence feels full, patient, almost sentient. Somewhere in that silence, history curls upon itself like a sleeping serpent, content to be rediscovered one lifetime at a time. The last candle gutters. The archaeologist rises, stretching the stiffness from his back. Beyond the monastery walls, the mist thickens, wrapping the trees until they resemble columns of forgotten temples. He imagines distant bells waiting to be rung, each one tuned to a different era. When they sound together, perhaps the harmonies of myth will finally align. The clay, the scripture, the whisper in the leaves. Until then, he leaves the room exactly as he found it. Quiet, uncertain, breathing. In the faint orange glow before dawn, dust dances like incense smoke above the table. What began as an excavation has become an invocation. The clay tablets rest, and the fog outside presses closer, carrying the low hum of the river. The moment feels suspended, neither ancient nor modern, but both. As the bell sounds once more, its tone mingles with the river's sigh, and the story begins its long walk toward memory, step by step, through mist and centuries, toward the next question waiting to be asked. The bell fades into the damp silence of morning. Inside the monastery's library, the air feels thicker now, scented with soot and parchment, with something older still, perhaps the quiet residue of thought itself. Beneath the lingering candle haze, our archaeologist's notes lie open beside the clay tablet. The symbols on its surface, once mere geometry, begin to hum with language. To read them is to touch a ghost made of sound. Each wedge stroke, each pressed line, is not simply a word, but a pulse, an echo of tongues that once shaped worlds. Language is the first metal ever forged. It bends, glows, and remembers its old shape. Across the plains of Mesopotamia, Sumerian gave way to Akkadian, Akkadian to Babylonian, each layer carrying the faint shimmer of the one before. The scribes knew this, though they may not have named it. They felt the weight of every word, the way a smith feels the resonance of iron beneath his hammer. When they wrote the name Tiamat, they were not simply naming a goddess, they were describing the sound of the sea when it swallows itself. When, millennia later, Hebrew poets spoke of tehom, the deep, they were echoing that same sound. Between Tiamat and tehom, between the roar of a goddess and the breath of a verse, lies the soft corridor where myth migrates. The archaeologist traces the curve of the letter with his fingertip. He imagines it whispered aloud, first by a priest in a temple thick with incense, then by a nomad under the stars, then by a prophet beside a river in exile. The word changes clothes, but not its heartbeat. And he wonders, did those ancient writers know they were speaking in borrowed tones? Or did they believe, as all storytellers do, that words descend like dew, belonging to whoever catches them first? He leans back, feeling the stone bench cold against his shoulders. Around him, scrolls whisper, some are in Aramaic, others in Greek, a few in Latin glosses that attempt to cage meanings older than their alphabets. He remembers a line from a medieval codex, a note scrawled by a monk of the Templar order. Every word hides its own parent. Perhaps that is what drew the Templars to study both scripture and sorcery, theology and translation. They understood, instinctively, that faith and language are twins. Both can sanctify, both can deceive. Outside, the first beam of sun pierces the mist, spilling gold across the floor. The light strikes the tablet, and for a moment, the engraved signs gleam like molten bronze. The archaeologist smiles. He sees a pattern forming, a rhythm between syllables and symbols, between one age and another. The link between Tiamat and tehom may not be proof of direct descent, but the resemblance carries weight. It is less the certainty of lineage and more the murmur of recognition, like seeing your reflection rippling in another river. He jots in his notebook. Myth travels through phonetics as rivers through valleys. He adds a second line. Meanings change, music remains. Then he closes the book and listens. Somewhere deeper in the monastery, another scholar is turning pages, and the faint rasp of vellum sounds like a whisper carried from the Bronze Age. It is almost as if the languages themselves breathe, each exhalation leaving a mist of meaning for the next to inhale. Language is a labyrinth that remembers its builders. The Sumerians spoke of divine clay, the Hebrews of sacred breath, the Greeks of logos, and the monks of verbum. Yet all return to the same pulse, the human desire to name what is beyond naming. In this, perhaps, lies the truest kinship between myth and prayer. When a scribe inscribed Tiamat, he was trying to contain the sea. When the psalmist wrote the deep, he was doing the same. The words are spells against the terror of infinity. The archaeologist rises and walks the corridor where banners hang limp in the morning chill. On one banner, the red cross of the Templar glows faintly, catching the stray beam of sun. He imagines those knights centuries ago poring over similar tablets, weighing translation as if it were a form of alchemy. They must have seen what he sees now. That language itself is the bridge between gods and mortals, between clay and scripture. Perhaps that was why they built their libraries beside their armories. Both housed weapons of belief. He returns to his desk and opens another fragment, one half erased by time. The inscription begins with the sign for water, then darkness, then something like a swirl, interpreted by some as chaos, by others as womb. The debate echoes through scholarship. Was Tiamat truly a monster, or was she the maternal sea, misread through patriarchal eyes? He smiles faintly at the irony that every translation carries its own theology. To choose monster or mother is to tilt the axis of creation itself. He takes a deep breath. The scent of parchment blends with the cold tang of metal from the nearby candle holder. The line between scholarship and devotion blurs. What began as study becomes almost liturgical. He whispers the words again, Tiamat, tehom. The sounds seem to fold into one another until distinction dissolves. It is like hearing a bell from two distant villages ringing in the same key. Then comes the question that always follows discovery. What does this mean for belief? To many, such parallels may sound like theft, but perhaps they are more like inheritance. Faith is not diminished by ancestry, it is deepened. To know that stories have roots older than one's own scripture is to stand humbly in a longer lineage of wonder. The archaeologist knows this instinctively. He does not seek to unravel faith, but to understand the loom upon which it was woven. The light in the room changes again, warmer, fuller. Dust dances in its path. Each particle glows, then drifts downward, as if mimicking the descent of meaning through centuries. For a moment, he closes his eyes and hears the cadence of languages layered one atop another. Sumerian chants beneath Hebrew psalms, Latin hymns over Arabic commentaries, all blending into one slow exhale. It sounds like the world breathing through its many mouths. He notes how every tongue carries traces of the one before, how even modern words for creation echo the texture of clay and breath. The Latin creare means to bring forth, yet its rhythm recalls the movement of shaping hands. Language remembers touch, the stylus pressing into clay, the quill scratching parchment, the fingers on a typewriter. All are variations of the same gesture, marking the world to say, "We were here." He sets down his pen and lets silence gather again. Outside, the mist is thinning. Birds begin their cautious songs. In the stillness, he imagines that each chirp might be a syllable of an older tongue, untranslatable, but not forgotten. The garden of myth, he realizes, is not lost. It simply grows new dialects. He closes the tablet box, but its memory lingers. The connection between Tiamat and tehom may remain unproven, yet the resonance cannot be denied. Whether by shared root or shared awe, both words pulse with the same truth. Before all things, there was water, and in that water, the sound of becoming. He pictures the first scribe dipping his reed into ink, hearing waves crash against temple walls, writing a word that would ripple through millennia until it reached this quiet morning. The archaeologist gathers his notes. On the margin, he sketches a bridge arcing over two rivers, one labelled Tigris, the other Euphrates. Between them, he writes, Language is the bridge of myth. He smiles, satisfied, then closes his journal. The bell from the courtyard rings again, steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat, returning to rest. As he steps out into the courtyard, mist curls around his boots. The air carries the metallic tang of dew on iron railings, and somewhere a raven croaks once, black against the whitening sky. The sun is rising. Its light will soon reveal the carvings on the monastery's door. 2 serpents intertwined beneath an open book. He pauses, letting his hand rest on the cold wood. The carvings seem to move under his touch, alive with the same breath that once animated clay. The door creaks open. Warm light spills from within, carrying the faint scent of bread from the refectory. The day begins anew, but inside his mind, the echoes of ancient words continue to resound, shaping thought like hammer to steel. Their rhythm follows him down the corridor, a pulse beneath every step. It is the sound of knowledge being born again, patient and endless. And somewhere ahead, beyond the library, the next discovery waits, half buried, half awake, whispering through the fog. The morning lengthens over the valley like a soft unfurling of silk. The mist has begun to thin, retreating toward the tree line, yet it lingers in corners and hollows, as though reluctant to surrender its secrets. Inside the monastery, the archaeologist now stands before a wall map, an expanse of parchment stretched and faded, its rivers drawn in faint blue ink, its cities marked by tiny crosses and circles. The map trembles slightly where the breeze from the open window brushes its surface, and for a moment it looks alive, a breathing body of time. This is where the story expands, no longer confined to a single word or tablet, but stretched across centuries and civilizations, like constellations drawn between invisible stars. He steps closer, tracing with his finger a path that runs from the marshlands of ancient Sumer to the plains of Canaan, then to the rugged hills where Babylon once cast its golden shadow. The journey is not straight. It twists like the riverbeds themselves. Myths rarely travel in lines. They meander, settle, and rise again in unexpected places. On the edge of the map, someone, perhaps a long-gone Templar scribe, has inked a small note in Latin. Tempus est flumen. Time is a river. The phrase feels truer now than ever. A single candle flickers on the table beneath the map, its flame reflecting off a polished steel compass once used by the Order's cartographers. He picks it up, feels its weight, heavy, cool, patient. The compass was built to find direction, but here in this room, it seems to serve a subtler purpose, reminding him that every coordinate, every date or dynasty, is but a point upon a greater circle. To follow the evolution of myth is to follow that circle's slow turning. From clay to scripture to echo, he opens a notebook filled with sketches, timelines of mythic parallels, a slow genealogy of symbols. At one end, he marks Enuma Elish, the Song of Beginnings, the cosmic duel of Tiamat and Marduk. Further along, the Atrahasis epic, where a great flood humbles the world. Beyond that, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first human lament for mortality. And then, centuries later, the composition of Genesis, shaped during exile among the Babylonians. Each of these marks pulses with meaning. Each a rung on the same long ladder humans have been climbing toward understanding. He can almost hear them, those old voices, overlapping across the centuries, humming the same melody in different tongues. The candlelight softens, and his mind drifts backward into the heat of Mesopotamia, where scribes bent over tablets while reed styluses whispered across wet clay. He imagines the hum of the city, the smell of baked brick, the calls of merchants near the temple gates. Perhaps it was there, under that same sky, that the earliest version of the creation story was first recited. Gods forming the world from chaos, humans shaped as helpers, the balance between obedience and rebellion set as the rhythm of existence. He feels the echo of that world vibrating faintly beneath the later biblical text, like an old song heard under a new arrangement. And then his imagination leaps forward to Babylon, the city of exiles. Here, Hebrew scribes sat beside their conquerors' rivers, writing memories of home, composing stories of origin not just to remember, but to endure. The clay beneath their feet was the same clay once moulded into Adamu, the same dust that had birthed both myth and man. What better medium for grief and survival than myth itself? It was a vessel, carrying fragments of the old into the new, reshaping memory into faith. To call Genesis a creation was accurate twice over. It created a world within words and a people within exile. The archaeologist breathes in the scent of the candle, a thin trace of honey and smoke. Around him, the great library seems to vibrate softly, as if the centuries pressed close, whispering their overlaps. He marks the dates carefully. Enuma Elish, around 1700 BCE. Atrahasis, perhaps a century earlier. Exile in Babylon, around 600 BCE. He draws a line connecting them, not to confine the mystery, but to give it shape. Without shape, knowledge is missed. With too much shape, it becomes stone. The balance is delicate. His thoughts wander to the Templars again. He imagines one of them, Brother Renard perhaps, standing before this same map centuries later, seeing not rivers and kingdoms, but symbols. For those monks of steel and silence, history itself was a kind of scripture. Each event an allegory. They collected relics, manuscripts, rumours. They saw in the convergence of myths the fingerprint of something divine. To them, patterns were proof of purpose. For the archaeologist, they are evidence of endurance. Both views, he realises, are forms of reverence. The bell rings once outside, summoning the hour of terce. Monks begin to chant, their voices low, braided with echo. The sound seeps through the stone and joins his reflections. He can hear, within their Latin hymns, the same cadence that once shaped the hymns to Marduk. Steady, repetitive, spiralling upward like smoke. Rituals change their language, but not their architecture. The human longing for rhythm survives every conquest. He steps closer to the window. The fog has begun to lift from the hills, revealing terraces of pale green where the morning light breaks in gold shards. The valley below is threaded with a thin river, curling like a script half-written. He realises with quiet awe that the map on the wall and the landscape outside mirror each other. One carved by ink, the other by time. The correspondence feels intimate, as if the world itself were participating in the act of translation. He turns back to the map and draws a small circle around Babylon, then traces a line toward Jerusalem. Between those 2 points, myth was refined, shaken, sieved, and sanctified. The exiles took the language of their captors and poured their own God into it, turning polytheistic imagery into monotheistic theology. Yet beneath that transformation, the skeleton of the older tales remained. The deep, the serpent, the flood, the forbidden knowledge. It was as though the new story was written atop the ghost of the old one, each word echoing faintly through the parchment. The archaeologist lowers his pen and lets the candle burn low. The room fills with the scent of melting wax. He imagines time not as a straight road, but as layers of clay pressed one atop another. Each generation inscribes its story, fires it in the kiln of memory, then buries it beneath fresh earth. The future unearths it, brushes away the dust, and finds itself staring into a mirror of its own mind. That is what archaeology truly is, not the study of the past, but the rediscovery of humanity's recurring dreams. He thinks of the phrase the Templar had written, tempus est flumen. Time is a river, but perhaps, he muses, time is also a spiral well, each descent bringing one closer to origins that never truly ended. Maybe the myth of creation was never about a beginning at all, but about the continuous act of becoming, the endless revision of meaning, the clay tablet, the scripture, the illuminated manuscript. They are all ripples from the same stone dropped into the water of consciousness. Outside, the chanting fades. The wind rises, stirring the candle flame, scattering its light across the map so that the rivers seem to shimmer. The archaeologist closes his eyes. In the silence between gusts, he can almost hear them, the layered voices of those who once wrote, recited, or believed. Their tones are neither in agreement nor in conflict. They form a kind of polyphonic murmur, the music of human curiosity itself. He rolls up the map, ties it with a strip of red silk, and sets it aside. The air feels heavier now, filled with the residue of thought. Somewhere beneath the monastery floor, a spring murmurs, feeding the fountain in the cloister courtyard. He listens to it and smiles. The sound is the same that once filled the plains of Sumer, the same that inspired both myth and prayer. Time, it seems, is not just a river. It is also the song of water against stone, repeating until someone decides to give it words. The last of the mist has cleared. The valley opens wide under the noon sun, and the shadows of the monastery stretch long and thin. The archaeologist gathers his notes, tucks the compass into his coat, and walks toward the cloister door. As he passes the fountain, he pauses to watch a single drop fall from the spout, ripple the surface, and vanish. In that ripple, he sees the entire chronology he has traced, the collision of ages, the quiet persistence of meaning. The sound of the drop fades into stillness, and the world exhales once more. And in that breath, as the faint ring of water fades into air, another question rises. Where do myths go when memory sleeps? The answer, perhaps, waits just beyond the next doorway, where ink and earth will again exchange whispers under the patient gaze of a night's silent statue, keeping watch over time's long tide. The fog has burned away by noon, leaving the world washed in the colour of pale brass. The monastery's courtyard glints beneath a thin sun, and beyond its walls, the forest sways like a sea of dark feathers. Inside, the archaeologist stands again before his table, where a new set of fragments waits. Small, cracked tablets that carry the stories of flesh and breath, of creation by hand. This is the tale of humans moulded from dust, of clay turned to skin. The air smells faintly of rain-soaked soil, and in that scent lies the key to all beginnings. He lifts one tablet gently, feeling its rough surface under his thumb. The script is uneven, hurried, perhaps written in the final heat of a dying fire. When the words are read aloud, they describe gods kneeling at the edge of the earth, mixing clay with the blood of divine beings to form humanity. He imagines that scene, a trembling shore, wet hands sculpting limbs, faces still glistening with moisture. Somewhere nearby, the river sighs, carrying reeds and silt, nature lending its own ingredients to the first act of creation. The image is older than scripture, yet intimately familiar. The pulse of it runs beneath every myth that would later claim to be the first. In that dusty room, the archaeologist feels his breath deepen. There is something strangely tender in the thought of creation by touch. Not lightning, not command, but craft. The gods, it seems, were once artisans. Their fingers pressed the earth like potters shaping vessels. Their breath warmed the clay into life. It is a story that makes humanity not an afterthought, but an artwork, and he wonders whether the writers of Genesis knew this older version, that when they wrote of Adam, formed from the dust of the ground, they were repeating an echo that had already passed through centuries of lips and styluses. He sets the tablet down beside a later text from the Sumerian tradition. This one names the creator, goddess Nama, who kneads the clay with care, her hands guided by divine wisdom. Her companion shapes the figures that will walk upon the earth, giving them both strength and fragility. What fascinates him most is how this act of shaping repeats itself across continents. In Egypt, Khnum turns his wheel to form bodies. In Greek myth, Prometheus sculpts man from the soil of Panopeus. Always there is clay, and always the touch of the divine. The motif stretches across time, like a memory we cannot shake. Outside, the wind begins to hum against the glass panes, a low, steady sound like breath itself. He looks toward the window, and for a heartbeat, he can almost believe he sees movement in the shadows, the earth remembering the warmth of those first hands. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps the clay beneath all civilizations still stirs with that ancient pulse. He closes his eyes, and the hum of wind becomes the murmur of a potter's wheel turning, a rhythm as old as language. He recalls the moment when he first uncovered the name Adamu in a brittle tablet, the syllables coarse yet recognizable. To speak that name aloud is to awaken a sense of kinship so deep it borders on ache. The Sumerian Adamu, like the biblical Adam, was formed in a sacred enclosure, a garden rich with rivers and light. But there, in that older text, Adamu is not simply human. He stands among gods, perhaps even a god himself, brought down to mortality. Some scholars dismiss this as poetic metaphor, others as divine demotion. Yet, to the archaeologist, it feels less like punishment and more like transition. The clay remembers being divine. The human remembers being dust. Between those two memories lies the entire span of existence. He writes slowly in his journal. Perhaps Adam was not made from earth to humble him, but to remind him what he shared with it. The sentence feels soft, uncertain, yet right. He thinks of the monks who once lived in these halls, tending gardens behind the abbey, their hands deep in soil. Maybe, without realizing it, they were reenacting the oldest ritual of all, shaping, planting, giving breath to the ground. The act of working with earth is always a conversation between what lives and what will. A small sound startles him, the clatter of a falling quill. It rolls across the table, leaving a thin trail of ink that curves like a river. He watches it, entranced. The motion feels symbolic, as if the world itself were reminding him that creation is never clean. Even in myth, life begins with mess, soil under nails, ink spilling into patterns that look accidental until they aren't. The gods, too, must have left smudges on their first attempts. He turns back to the fragments, arranging them like puzzle pieces. Some are too broken to fit, yet he can sense the missing lines. There is one that speaks of breath entering clay, a motif that survives intact into Hebrew. He murmurs the words under his breath, letting them vibrate in his throat. The sound feels warm, intimate, almost sacred. It is not hard to imagine that breath being the earliest form of prayer, the exhale of wonder at existing at all. From another box, he retrieves a fragment showing a god kneeling beside his creation, face close, eyes closed, as if listening for heartbeat. It's an image of affection more than authority. In this version, divinity does not tower above humanity. It kneels to meet it. That reversal touches him deeply. It undermines the idea of dominance and replaces it with intimacy. Perhaps the earliest makers of myth understood something modern minds have forgotten. that the sacred is not always distant. Sometimes it is the soil itself, pressed gently into shape by love. He stands and stretches, feeling the stiffness in his back. Outside, clouds gather again, dark and heavy. Thunder murmurs in the far hills, and the smell of rain drifts through the window. It feels fitting. The birth of man, after all, was also a storm of elements: water, earth, and the breath that binds them. The archaeologist places the fragments back into their box, layering cloth between them like sheets of memory. On the lid, he writes, Adamu and the Garden of Clay. The words look humble beside the grandeur they hold. Rain begins to fall, a slow, measured tapping that fills the silence. He watches the drops strike the courtyard stones, darkening them one by one until the whole ground gleams like wet skin. The sight pulls at something inside him. Perhaps the old scribes felt this too. The recognition that life and weather are kin, that creation never truly ended but continues each time rain meets earth. He returns to his seat and opens a newer manuscript, a medieval translation copied by the Templars. In its margins are notes linking the story of Adam to alchemical practice, the transformation of base matter into spirit. One monk writes, "As clay becomes vessel, so flesh becomes soul." The line strikes him as both naive and profound. The Templars, those armoured scholars, must have seen in the myth of Adam not just theology, but metaphor, the idea that the divine process of creation repeats within every act of refinement, every search for light inside darkness. To shape clay was to reenact the first morning of the world. The thunder grows louder, rolling like a drumbeat through the valley. He lets it fill the room, letting sound become time itself. The candle flame wavers, its shadow stretching across the table like an outstretched arm. For an instant, he imagines that arm belongs to one of the first gods, reaching through centuries to remind him creation was never a single moment. It was an art, and art never ends. The rain softens, becomes a mist again. He looks at his hands, the faint traces of dust and ink across his fingers. They are, he realizes, not so different from those first hands. Each writer, each artist, each seeker is repeating that gesture, pressing form into chaos, whispering life into matter. He feels humbled by the thought and oddly comforted. The myth has never belonged to any one people. It belongs to the act itself, to the simple miracle of making. The bell rings for evening prayer. The sound flows through the corridors like water through channels, echoing against stone. The archaeologist closes his notes, takes one last look at the clay fragments, and smiles. The rain's rhythm and the bell's tone merge into a single heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the walls, in the deep forest, the scent of wet earth rises again, rich and alive. He knows the next step awaits. The story of the woman, born not from dust, but from something closer, something human. But for now, he lets the quiet settle, the sound of rain blurring into breath, carrying him softly into the approaching dusk. Evening slides through the cloister like a slow tide of copper and smoke. The air is soft now, thick with the scent of rain drying on stone. In the monastery library, the archaeologist lights a single candle. Its glow moves gently across the table, where two tablets rest side by side, one bearing the Sumerian hymn of Enki and Ninhursag, the other a fragment of Genesis. Between them lies a gulf of centuries, yet the same rhythm breathes beneath both. The story of a woman born from the body of another, a rib turned into life. He runs his fingers along the Sumerian tablet, tracing the wedge marks that tell of Ninhursag. the goddess of the mountains, and her creation of woman. The text speaks of Enki, the god of wisdom, who falls ill. His ribs ache, and from his pain, Ninhursag shapes a healer named Ninti, the lady of the rib, or the lady who makes live. The play of words is delicate. In Sumerian, rib and life share the same sound. A pun, yes, but one infused with reverence. Here, language itself performs a miracle. One word births two meanings, just as one body gives rise to another. The archaeologist leans closer, letting the candlelight dance across the clay. He murmurs the ancient syllables, tasting them like prayer. Ninti, it rolls off the tongue softly, almost like a sigh. The room feels alive with her presence, the air thickening as though time itself leans forward to listen. He imagines the temple where her story was first told. Pillars carved with vines, torches flickering against reliefs of serpents and goddesses. In that temple, woman was not made to serve but to heal. She emerged as remedy, not consequence. When the myth travelled westward, carried by traders and scribes, it changed robes but kept its bones. By the time the Hebrew authors composed Genesis, the linguistic pun had become a theological revelation. The woman came from man's rib. Yet in translation, the nuance shifted. The goddess who restored life became the companion who was taken from man. What was once a gesture of healing became an act of dependency. The archaeologist's pen hesitates above his notebook. He writes slowly, "In the beginning, she was not taken. She was given." The candle flickers as the wind passes through the old corridor. Shadows ripple across the table like breathing. He pictures Eve's awakening in Eden. The first blink, the first inhale, the scent of green air. No sin, no shame yet, only astonishment. Around her, leaves shimmer with dew. The earth itself seems to whisper her name. Perhaps this, he thinks, is how it was meant to be remembered. Not as division, but as dialogue. One life answering another. He turns to the second tablet, the one copied by the Templar monks. Its margins are filled with fine Latin commentary. The ink faded to brown. One note reads, "Vita de costa, mysteria conjunctionis." Life from the rib, the mystery of union. The Templar scribe had written a small cross beside it, as if to mark a point of meditation rather than proof. The archaeologist feels a strange kinship with that unknown monk. Across the gulf of centuries, they share the same cautious awe before the same enigma. How a myth changes, yet remains itself. He imagines the scribe at work centuries ago, in a cell much like this one, the night alive with the sound of rain on the roof. The monk dips his quill, writing by the rhythm of distant thunder. To him, Ninti and Eve are not contradictions, but harmonies, two notes in one celestial song. Perhaps the Templars, those knights of paradox, understood that holiness lives in synthesis, not in purity. Their order guarded relics of war and words of peace, believing both could lead to revelation. The archaeologist smiles faintly at the thought. He can almost hear the scrape of quills, the low hum of Gregorian chant outside the door. The sound carries him deeper into reflection. He begins to see Eve not as the cause of a fall, but as the embodiment of a return. A reminder that creation is an act shared, never solitary. When she breathes, the clay breathes again. When she names the living things, the divine voice continues through her tongue. He opens a modern translation of the Sumerian myth, its pages crisp and white against the dim room. The commentary argues that the rib in the Ninti story may have been misread, that it referred instead to life, and that the biblical tale confused the two. He reads this not as correction, but as testament to how fragile translation can be. A single sound, slightly altered, can shift the axis of meaning. Yet what fascinates him more is not the error, but its persistence. Humanity, it seems, needs both interpretations, the healer and the companion, the goddess and the woman. Together, they complete the circle. Outside, rain begins again, a gentle drumming on the cloister stones. The rhythm is steady, almost metronomic, like the pulse of an ancient heart. He feels it in his bones, that quiet sense that myths breathe through weather. He looks at the candle flame bending toward the draught and wonders if this too is part of the old story. The element of air, the breath of gods, moving through matter to remind it of its origin. In that moment, he senses how close myth and physics truly are. Both search for the same invisible bridge between cause and being. His mind drifts to the figures of Enki and Ninhursag. Their story is older than empires, yet so tenderly human. The god who suffers, the goddess who heals, the body fractured, then made whole. The pattern feels eternal. Division, longing, reunion. Maybe that's why the motif endures. It mirrors the pulse of the human heart itself. Each beat, after all, is a breaking and mending, a separation followed by return. He reaches for his journal and writes again, slower now. The first surgery in myth was an act of love. He pauses, lets the ink dry. He realizes that behind every retelling, whether Sumerian hymn or biblical verse, lurks the same desire: to explain how intimacy entered creation, how one being could contain another and yet remain whole. He finds comfort in that universality. It means that the longing for connection has been sacred from the start. The candle guttering low, he imagines Eve's first night under the stars, before shame had names. The air hums with insects. The river murmurs beyond the trees. She lies on the grass, feeling the warmth of the earth against her back, sensing the world breathe around her. Perhaps she does not yet know what loneliness means. The story tells us she was made as companion, but maybe companionship was the first divine instinct, not the first human need. The gods themselves, weary of solitude, pressed clay and breath together, simply to hear another voice in the silence. A gust of wind sneaks through the half-open window, extinguishing the candle. The room falls into silver darkness. For a while, the archaeologist sits without moving, listening to the rain's whisper and the faint creak of old beams. In that near darkness, the ancient words seem to hover, luminous and unspoken. Rib, life, gift. He feels their double meaning settle into him like a quiet truth. When he lights the candle again, its small flame seems warmer than before. He looks at the twin tablets, their edges glinting faintly in the glow. One belongs to Sumer, one to scripture, yet they face each other like mirrors. Between them, time folds. The archaeologist smiles and whispers, Ninti, Eve, both the same breath. The bell tolls for compline, a final call to prayer. Its note carries through the corridor, brushing the candle flame, turning it into a trembling halo. He gathers his notes carefully, tucks the tablets under linen, and stands. The air outside smells of wet ivy and iron. As he steps into the hallway, he feels the weight of centuries ease slightly, as though the myths themselves exhale in relief. The sound of the bell fades, leaving only the hush of rain and the promise of what comes next. A whisper of a serpent, a glint of forbidden fruit, waiting in the garden's deepening dark. The night has settled in full, a dark velvet sky stitched with faint stars beyond the arched window. The rain has thinned to a mist, and through it, the bell tower gleams like the edge of a blade cooled in moonlight. Inside the monastery library, the archaeologist returns to his table. 2 candles now burn instead of one, their flames leaning toward each other like whispering monks. Before him lies the next set of fragments, serpents curling across clay, trees etched in spirals, and a word written in a hand too precise to be ordinary. The moment feels charged, alive with the memory of something older than fear, older even than sin. He runs his finger across one of the serpent carvings. The creature's scales shimmer in relief, almost as if it moves when the light shifts. It is no villain here. Its tongue is forked not in deceit, but in wisdom. In Sumerian and Egyptian tablets alike, the serpent was sacred, guardian of healing, symbol of renewal. Its shedding of skin was rebirth, its coiling the endless cycle of time. Only much later, when myth turned toward moral order, did the serpent's silver tongue darken. The archaeologist knows this. He can almost feel the injustice of that transformation. How an emblem of intellect became the emblem of temptation. He closes his eyes and imagines the serpent in its first form, a creature of dusk, gliding through reeds along the rivers of the Fertile Crescent. The air is thick with the hum of insects and the scent of wet soil. In that half-light, it moves like water come alive, neither good nor evil, only aware. The sound it makes, soft and sibilant, is the same rhythm found in prayer and poetry. To listen is to learn patience. To see it shed its skin is to witness a resurrection. Perhaps that is why it frightened later theologians. Wisdom that renews itself cannot easily be controlled. He opens his journal to a page titled, "The Trickster's Voice." On the margin, he has drawn a small serpent twined around a tree. He writes beneath it, "The earliest serpent was not a liar, it was a teacher who used riddles." He pauses, then adds, "Tricksters survive by bending meaning, not by breaking it." Across cultures, he recalls, the serpent's kin appear everywhere. The coyote of America, the raven of the north, the fox of Japan, all of them carry the same task: to disrupt certainty, to make creation re-examine itself. He leans back, staring into the wavering light. The room smells of wax and ink. For a moment, he imagines that the candles are torches in an ancient temple, and that he is not a scholar but a priest, charged with interpreting signs left by gods who have since grown silent. The serpent's story, he realizes, is not one of downfall, but of dialogue. The tension between obedience and curiosity, between stillness and motion. Without that tension, there is no growth. Without the question whispered in the dark, there is no dawn. He turns to the Hebrew text and reads the passage where the serpent speaks to Eve. The words are familiar, yet in the quiet of the monastery, they sound different. The serpent does not shout. It reasons. Its tone is not malice, but persuasion. "You shall not surely die." It is a riddle disguised as comfort, a teacher disguised as tempter. He wonders whether this conversation was ever meant to be one-sided. Perhaps Eve's act of listening was the first exercise of human thought. The fruit she reached for might not have been disobedience, but understanding itself. Outside, thunder rumbles distantly over the forest, low and slow. The candles tremble, their flames bowing with each vibration. He feels the resonance in his ribs, a reminder that even silence carries sound if one listens closely enough. Somewhere deep in that sound is the same pulse that guided the first storytellers. Every myth, he thinks, begins with a noise mistaken for a voice. He recalls a detail from one of the lesser-known Mesopotamian hymns, a serpent who guards the plant of eternal life, refusing even kings to touch it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero loses immortality because of such a creature. The serpent steals the herb and renews itself, leaving the man to grow old. The pattern is hauntingly familiar. The symbol of regeneration stands opposite to humanity's desire for permanence. The snake wins because it accepts change. Humanity loses because it cannot. He writes in the margin, "To be human is to mistake wisdom for threat." The ink dries slowly, spreading like veins. He glances up at the old Templar crest hanging on the wall. 2 knights sharing one horse, their faces carved into calm paradox. Perhaps, he muses, that image too holds a hidden echo of the serpent's lesson. Balance within opposition, unity within difference. The Templars, straddling faith and inquiry, would have understood. They built their strength upon contradiction, just as myth does. He flips open a medieval bestiary resting nearby. Its serpent is painted in lapis and gold, eyes luminous, body coiled around a chalice. Beneath the image, a note in Latin reads, "Sapientia sub lingua serpentis est." Wisdom lies beneath the serpent's tongue. He smiles faintly. Someone, long ago, remembered. Even when the church taught fear, the illuminator's brush betrayed reverence. Perhaps this was the quiet rebellion of the scribe, to preserve awe beneath the armor of doctrine. He imagines a Templar monk copying the Genesis tale by candlelight, pausing on the line, "The serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field." Maybe the monk hesitated before the word subtle, knowing that in Latin it means woven beneath, thoi. The serpent, then, is not merely crafty. It is interlaced through creation itself, a hidden filament of understanding. The monk would have smiled privately, knowing that every illuminated border, every vine and spiral, secretly honoured the very creature condemned by the text. The archaeologist looks toward the window. The storm has passed. Moonlight spreads across the courtyard, pale and forgiving. He pictures the garden again. Not the Eden of sermons, but an older, wilder place. There, the serpent coils around the roots of the tree of knowing, neither good nor evil, simply present. Eve kneels, curious but unafraid. The wind moves through the leaves like a whisper of parchment turning. The world is still in balance, innocence and awareness breathing the same air. The bite that will come is only the inevitable turning of the page. He senses that this myth was never meant as condemnation, but as explanation. Consciousness, once awakened, cannot be returned to sleep. The serpent's whisper did not ruin paradise. It revealed that paradise was fragile illusion. Awareness always ends simplicity. Yet through that ending, a greater depth begins. He smiles softly, realizing that even this thought echoes the oldest duality, fall and ascent as 2 faces of the same climb. He pours a small cup of wine from the flask the monks left at his table. The liquid catches the candlelight, glowing like molten garnet. He raises it slightly toward the serpent carving, a silent toast to the teacher who survived exile from theology. To curiosity, he whispers, to the courage of the question. Then he drinks, the warmth spreading through him like dawn. The second candle sputters low. Wax pools at its base, forming small rivers of light. He traces the melted lines with his eyes, thinking how they resemble the winding of the Tigris and Euphrates on ancient maps. Rivers, serpents, knowledge, they all coil and move alike. They twist, not to deceive, but to reach further. The world's oldest stories always understood that wisdom is not a straight path. It loops, circles back, renews. He sets down the cup and closes his notebook. The air hums gently, filled with a kind of expectant calm. Beyond the walls, the forest exhales fog again, soft and silvery. Somewhere within it, he imagines the faint rustle of scales moving through leaves. Not threat, not sin, just movement, endless and serene. The serpent is still there, keeping the rhythm of renewal. He stands and walks toward the corridor, the echo of his boots like slow drumbeats in the hush. At the far end, another candle flickers before the statue of a knight. its armor dulled with age. The sword he holds is carved with serpentine patterns, a forgotten homage. The archaeologist bows his head as he passes, the gesture half reverence, half recognition. As he steps outside, the chill of midnight greets him. The moon, round and full, hangs above the trees like a silent eye. The serpent of myth has vanished into shadow, but its lesson remains. Knowledge must always shed its skin to survive. He inhales the cool air, tasting the faint sweetness of pine. In the distance, a nightingale begins to sing, its voice curling upward like smoke. The melody lingers, delicate and deliberate, a reminder that even in darkness, wisdom hums softly, waiting to be heard. Dawn returns like a slow awakening. The rain has passed, and mist curls above the monastery roofs in thin ribbons of silver. The air is heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. In the refectory below, monks move silently, their sandals brushing the flagstones in rhythm with prayer. The archaeologist watches them through a high window, his hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea. His eyes are distant. The night study still lingers in his mind. The serpent's whisper, the trembling of leaves, the awakening of knowledge. But now his attention drifts to a new question. One carved not in metaphor, but in mud. How did the world almost end before it truly began? He returns to his table, where two wooden crates sit open, lined with linen. Inside them lie fragments from the Atrahasis tablets, rescued from the Tigris floodplain. The clay still smells faintly of river water, as if it remembers what it once described. The story is older than Moses, older than Abraham. Yet, when read aloud, its pulse feels eerily familiar. It speaks of gods angered by the noise of humanity, of a flood sent to cleanse the earth, of one man warned in a dream to build a great vessel. The archaeologist closes his eyes and whispers the name, Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. In another age, he will become Noah. He spreads the fragments gently across the table, the candlelight sliding over them like shallow waves. One tablet details the construction of the boat, its exact dimensions, its decks, its storehouses for grain and seed. Another describes the animals gathered in pairs, each species named and accounted for. Even the birds appear: raven, swallow, dove. He reads of the torrential rain, the deluge that swallows mountains, and finally, of the single window through which Atrahasis releases a dove to test the receding waters. It is all there, every element that will one day become the story of Noah, translated from clay to parchment, from many gods to one. The archaeologist feels the thrill of recognition again, but this time it is not the quiet thrill of discovery. It is awe. To read this is to realize how stories survive catastrophe by imitating it. The flood was both ending and preservation. The deluge erased a world, but carved its memory into myth. And the myth, in turn, became the arc that carried meaning across millennia. He imagines the first storyteller who recited these lines beside a fire while survivors huddled close, still smelling of mud and fear. The flames reflected in their eyes must have looked like waves, the crackle like thunder. They must have understood that the story itself was a vessel, one that could keep humanity afloat long after the waters had dried. He opens another fragment, its edges charred and fragile. It describes the sacrifice made after the flood, a meal offered to the gods, smoke rising into a clean sky. The detail is vivid, the scent of roasted grain, the perfume of cedar, the gods gathering like flies to the aroma. When he reads that, the archaeologist feels a shiver of tenderness. The image is strange, almost humorous, but profoundly human. Even deities, it seems, crave the comfort of food after disaster. In Genesis, that tenderness remains, though softened, the Lord smelling a sweet savour from Noah's altar. In both, there is relief, forgiveness, the weary gratitude that follows endurance. He writes in his notebook, "Flood myths are not about destruction, they are about memory surviving water." The sentence comforts him. Outside, the sun edges over the horizon, gilding the mist in pink and amber. The valley below glimmers like a sea briefly remembered by the earth. For a moment, he imagines that all of history lies beneath that fog, waiting to surface again when the right words are spoken. A draft moves through the room, making the candle flame dance. It reminds him of another story, the tale of Utnapishtim from the Epic of Gilgamesh. There too the flood cleanses the world. There too the hero survives by divine instruction, sealing himself in a massive vessel coated with pitch. The difference is only in tone. In Atrahasis, the flood is punishment for noise. In Genesis, it is punishment for corruption. In Gilgamesh, it becomes the melancholy of mortality, but beneath each lies the same ancient fear that the world is fragile, that divine patience is finite, that survival depends on listening to whispers before the storm. The archaeologist takes a slow breath and lets his eyes close. He imagines the sound of rain falling on the roof of Atrahasis' boat. Thousands of drops drumming in unison, drowning prayers. The smell of animals, the creak of wood, the claustrophobic darkness of endurance. Then silence, vast and terrible, when the rain finally ceases. In that silence, he imagines the first ray of sunlight piercing through the cloud, striking water that reflects not ruin, but renewal. The myth, he thinks, was never about divine wrath. It was about the delicate contract between world and witness. He turns the fragment over and sees faint marks that could be fingerprints, those of the ancient scribe who pressed the clay before it hardened. He feels a strange kinship with that unknown artisan. Both of them, across ages, work to preserve what must not drown. The scribe's clay, his ink, two methods of defiance against forgetfulness. He wonders if the Templar monks who once guarded these relics understood that their task was not just piety, but preservation. Each copy of a manuscript was a plank in an ark built from language. The candlelight flickers again, catching the edges of a bronze astrolabe on the shelf. Its shadow spins across the wall like the slow hand of time. He recalls how the Templars, navigating between crusade and contemplation, must have pondered these same floods, not as history, but as symbol. To them, the deluge represented purification through trial, the forging of soul in water's relentless patience. Perhaps, in their rituals, they saw themselves as new builders of arks, tasked with carrying fragments of wisdom through the storms of ignorance. He smiles faintly, imagining a knight writing by torchlight, his steel gauntlet reflecting the glow as he traces a verse from Genesis. Maybe he too felt the pull of older myths under the Christian surface. Maybe he wondered, as this archaeologist now does, whether the divine truly destroys or only transforms. Water, after all, does not end what it touches. It reshapes it. Every flood leaves behind new soil, fertile and waiting. Outside, the bell tolls the hour of prime. The monks' voices rise in a low chant, weaving through the sound of dripping eaves. Their Latin echoes the rhythm of floodwaters rising and falling. He lets the chant carry him, feeling its cadence pulse with the heartbeat of every deluge story ever told. It is the sound of surrender and survival at once. He returns to his journal and writes, "Perhaps the ark is not a vessel, but a sentence that holds us above chaos." The thought feels right. Myths endure not because they happened, but because they keep happening. Each generation faces its own waters, its own fear of erasure, and each builds anew, not from lumber, but from language. The last of the candle wax has pooled on the table, glistening like the calm after rain. He dips his finger into it absently, tracing a curve that looks like a wave curling back into itself. The motion soothes him. He thinks of the flood receding, of Atrahasis stepping onto dry ground, of Noah's olive branch glistening in sunlight. Life always returns. Even after deluge, the world smells of beginnings. He looks up, and through the window, the valley is bright now. The river below flashes silver, winding like a serpent of light between hills. He smiles at the symmetry. Serpent and flood, temptation and survival, two sides of the same sacred cycle. In one, knowledge brings the fall. In the other, wisdom brings endurance. Both lead humanity back to humility before creation. He closes his notebook gently. The silence afterward feels like the moment after rain, when the world seems to hold its breath, listening for its own heartbeat. He knows the next fragments will carry this story forward. The debates of difference, the question of gods and God, of polyphony and singularity. But for now, he lets the quiet fill him. The candle sputters, dies, and the morning light takes its place, golden and steady, like sunlight spilling through the clouds after the longest storm. The world feels newly washed, and in that clean silence, the story waits to continue its long voyage toward understanding. The air by midday is weightless, touched with gold. Clouds drift lazily above the monastery's towers, their reflections wavering across the courtyard fountain. The archaeologist sits by the open window, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, sunlight warming the pages of his notes. He has spent the morning mapping parallels, lines drawn between Mesopotamian clay and Hebrew parchment, between the storm of Atrahasis and the covenant of Noah. Yet even as the ink dries, he senses what must come next. To compare is not enough. He must ask what truly separates the tales, what theology blooms differently in each garden of story. The parallels shimmer, yes, but it is in their differences that meaning deepens. He pulls a larger sheet from his folder, a table of 2 columns. On one side, the symbols of Atrahasis, a council of gods, their anger swelling like thunder. On the other, the account of Genesis, one God, singular and sovereign. He studies the first line of both. The earth was filled with violence, versus the noise of mankind disturbed the gods. The contrast hums quietly between them. In the older tale, the divine grows weary of humanity's clamour. In the later one, the divine grieves its corruption. The emotion changes from irritation to sorrow. The difference seems small, but it is a revolution of tone. Humanity evolves from inconvenience to moral subject. The candle beside him has burned low, its wick swimming in amber wax. The air smells faintly of bees and ink. He leans forward, pen poised, and begins to annotate the columns. On the Mesopotamian side, he writes, polytheism, negotiation. On the Hebrew side, monotheism, more than a covenant. In the first, gods argue among themselves. In the second, one God speaks alone. He pauses to consider what that solitude means. Perhaps it was not just theology, but psychology. The human soul slowly consolidating its fears into one face, one voice that could listen back. He sips from a cup of cool water and imagines the storytellers of each tradition. In Babylon, priests reciting under ziggurat shadows, their words echoing through chambers of stone. In exile, Hebrew scribes writing by firelight, weaving their loss into a new beginning. Each tells the same story of flood and rebirth, but their gods behave differently. The Babylonian deities flee the storm in panic, Yahweh commands it. One myth comforts the powerful, chaos as bureaucratic accident. The other comforts the broken, chaos as moral trial. He sketches again, this time 2 circles that almost overlap. In their shared space, he writes, water, destruction, preservation, promise. Around the Sumerian circle, he adds appeasement, noise, fatigue. Around the Hebrew, covenant, justice, renewal. The image pleases him. It looks like 2 ripples meeting on the surface of memory, both born of the same stone, yet widening in different directions. A gust of wind slips through the window, stirring the edge of the page. He anchors it with his pen, smiling faintly. For all his precision, there is poetry in this work, a rhythm that refuses to be flattened into charts. He remembers a Templar motto carved above a doorway in this very monastery. Deus loquitur in differentiis. God speaks in differences. Perhaps, he muses, that is what myth does too. The truth hides not in symmetry, but in variation, in the way meaning shifts like light through stained glass. He turns back to the Atrahasis tablet. The flood ends, and the gods, frightened by their own wrath, gather like flies over the offering of the survivor. The image makes him laugh softly, divinity hungry, dishevelled, trembling. There is a fragile honesty in that. The divine in this world is not perfect, but anxious, craving the scent of its creation. In Genesis, by contrast, God inhales a sweet savour and speaks a vow. Never again shall I curse the ground for man's sake. One text shows fear, the other, mercy. Both are confessions of exhaustion. Both are divine apologies written in different tongues. He notes the nuance carefully. Myth evolves from appeasement to relationship, he writes, from bribe to bond. It feels like a heartbeat of progress, not moral superiority, but emotional maturation. The human imagination, once fragmented among many gods, learns to see wholeness in singular dialogue. To speak with one god is to believe the world listens back. Outside, a bee drifts lazily past the window, circling the scent of wax and dust. He watches its pattern, a spiral, tightening, then loosening again. The motion reminds him of floodwaters receding, of rivers curling through plains. Even nature speaks in parallels and contrasts. He smiles at the thought that perhaps all creation is one long act of translation. He rises and crosses to the bookshelf. There rests a bound volume, copied centuries ago by monks of this same order. Tabulae Diluvii, the tables of the flood. Its pages are thick, its ink nearly black. Margins are filled with Latin reflections, some reverent, some skeptical. One scribe has drawn a tiny sketch of an ark beside a ziggurat, as if to admit that both belong to the same ancestral dream. The archaeologist runs a finger over the drawing. In its simplicity lies a quiet confession. History never truly replaces myth. It only inherits its shapes. He sits again and opens a new page in his notebook, titling it Theological Divergence. Beneath it, he writes in steady lines, Polytheism externalizes guilt. Monotheism internalizes it. Flood as reset versus flood as rebirth. The gods regret creation. God mourns corruption. Atrahasis restores balance. Noah restores trust. The act of writing soothes him. Each line feels like a bridge laid across water. The bells of Sext begin to toll, deep and rhythmic. Their sound fills the room with soft vibration, mingling with the rustle of paper. He imagines the monks at prayer below, their voices lifting and falling like waves. In their chant, he hears both lament and promise. The same notes that pulse through every flood myth. All stories, it seems, end with a vow that destruction will be followed by grace. He leans back, closes his eyes. Behind his lids, two images overlap. Atrahasis on his ark beneath a boiling sky, and Noah standing in sunlight beside an olive branch. The same water glitters between them, different only in reflection. Perhaps, he thinks, the flood was never about wrath or sin, but about memory. Humanity must sometimes drown to remember it can breathe. He opens his eyes again, the light softer now, filtered through cloud. The fountain outside sparkles as drops leap and fall endlessly, mimicking the rhythm of ancient rain. The sound is hypnotic. He senses the earth turning, the weight of centuries balancing delicately upon a story told and retold. He whispers, almost to himself, "Myth is the tide of memory, always returning, never repeating." A single page flutters loose from his notes and drifts to the floor. When he picks it up, he notices a smudge where his thumb brushed wet ink. Two dark arcs that almost meet. It looks uncannily like the twin curves of his diagram. He laughs quietly. Even accidents, it seems, conspire towards symmetry. The shadows lengthen. Sunlight slants across the floor in amber bands, illuminating dust motes that spin like miniature worlds. He senses that his work today has built a bridge, not of proof, but of perception. The gulf between Mesopotamia and Israel, between gods and God, narrows into shared breath. Each tale, however altered, arises from the same longing, to explain why the world renews itself after ruin. He closes the folder gently. For a moment, the quiet feels absolute. The air smells of paper and stone. Outside, the last bee hums away toward the garden. He leans on the windowsill and looks at the sky, where pale clouds drift like faded pages. If the divine still speaks, he thinks, perhaps it does so in echoes, in differences that rhyme. A bell rings again, softer now, marking the close of midday prayer. The sound lingers like a sigh before dissolving into stillness. He watches a single leaf fall from the vine that climbs the outer wall, twisting gently through sunlight until it lands on the water's surface. The ripples widen, intersect, and fade. Two circles merging, just like his notes. He smiles, a quiet contentment settling in his chest. The work is far from over. The dialogue between myths still deepens. But for now, he lets the moment rest. The sunlight warms his hands, and the faint hum of the fountain whispers a bridge toward the next question, waiting patiently beyond the turn of dusk. Twilight descends upon the monastery like a veil of violet silk. The bells have long since ceased their tolling, leaving only the slow drip of water from the eaves and the muted stir of parchment shifting in the library. The archaeologist sits beneath the last glow of the stained glass window, its coloured light spilling in fractured patterns across his table. The golden reds paint his hands as he turns another page of notes. Tonight, he will not compare or classify. Tonight, he will listen to the arguments that refuse to rest. Every story, after all, must survive its own opposition. He opens a folder labelled Contradicciones. Within it lie letters, commentaries, and transcriptions of debates held across centuries. Theologians arguing over the age of texts, linguists tracing the origin of tehom, scholars of the Enlightenment insisting that resemblance does not equal inheritance. Their voices rise from the paper like a murmured tribunal. He reads the first note, a 19th century rebuttal to the theory of direct borrowing. Coincidence, not lineage. Universal archetypes, not plagiarism. The tone is crisp, defensive, almost indignant. The author cannot bear the thought that the garden might have foreign roots. He sets the letter down and gazes at the candle flame. It wavers, thin as breath. Coincidence, he whispers, testing the word. Can coincidence really stretch across millennia with such precision? Names, ribs, floods, serpents. Yet certainty feels equally arrogant. He prefers the language of probability, of proximity. Myths move like weather fronts, not caravans. They do not steal so much as drift. He writes in the margin, truth is not inherited intact. It migrates, shedding and gathering along the way. Outside, the wind sighs through cypress branches. The sound blends with the rustle of his notes until the night itself seems to join the debate. He imagines the critics sitting at this same table, one in a clerical collar, another in dusty spectacles, each defending the sanctity of their field. The text is unique, one would say. It stands alone, revealed. Another, tapping a clay shard, would counter, yet this pattern, this language, surely you see. The argument would go in circles, like the orbit of planets that never collide. Perhaps that, he muses, is what keeps scholarship alive, the tension between devotion and doubt. He reaches for a second stack of papers, translations of cuneiform hymns that complicate his own theories. One tablet once thought to mention Adamu may in fact say something else entirely. A title, not a name. A scribe's slip, a misread syllable. He smiles wearily. Even the best evidence is a soft flaw. Step too hard, and it shifts beneath you. Yet uncertainty does not discourage him. It feels strangely human, this endless negotiation with the unknown. The act of questioning is its own form of worship. He recalls a medieval commentary by a Templar scholar whose name was never signed. Only a red cross stamped at the end of the parchment. The writer warned that too much confidence in interpretation turns faith to stone and knowledge to sand. The archaeologist copies the line into his journal, adding his own reflection. Doubt is the bridge's heartbeat. Was. He pictures those knights of parchment and steel debating by torchlight, unafraid of paradox, aware that contradiction is not failure but breath, the inhale and exhale of understanding. He rises to stretch, his shadow stretching along the wall, where frescoes of saints fade into obscurity. In the dim light, their faces seem thoughtful, almost skeptical. He thinks of how even sacred art argues silently. One painter favouring gentle grace, another fierce judgment. Contradiction, he realises, is not corruption. It is texture. Without it, belief would flatten into propaganda. The thought soothes him. Returning to the table, he unfolds a letter from a modern theologian who defends the independence of Genesis. The divine revelation stands apart from mythic noise. To suggest borrowing is to diminish miracle. He traces the line with his finger, and then, beneath it, writes softly, "But to see divine patterns recurring is to enlarge miracle." The candle sputters, as if in agreement. If the same wisdom breathes through Sumer and through Scripture, perhaps the wonder lies not in separation, but in continuity. The sacred may be less a fortress than a river, its source forever elusive. He turns a page and finds a clipping from an old journal, a photograph of two archaeologists, one Muslim, one Christian, kneeling together at a dig site, brushing dust from a fragment of an ancient vessel. Their smiles are weary but shared. He studies the image a long time. It feels like an answer, more eloquent than any essay. Cooperation, not conquest, as the truest method of revelation. The relic itself does not care who unearths it. It only asks to be remembered. The clock in the corner strikes once, a muted note swallowed by stone. The hour is late. The candle gutters low, its halo shrinking. He closes his eyes for a moment, listening to the rhythm of his own breathing. Each inhale carries the scent of wax and parchment. Each exhale feels like surrender, doubt, belief, revision. They blend into one gentle cadence. He remembers a line from the Psalms: "Deep calls unto deep." Perhaps the deepest truth is this calling itself, the echo that never finds final rest. He opens his eyes again, noticing how the stained glass window now glows only faintly from the moon outside. The colours are muted, but the image, a boat upon water, a dove returning, remains clear. He smiles. Even darkness cannot erase outline. He writes in his notebook: "Faith persists through form, even when colour fades." That thought feels like reconciliation, a quiet handshake between reason and reverence. He considers the skeptics once more, their voices still murmuring through the paper. Some accuse comparative myth of arrogance, others accuse religion of amnesia. Both may be right, but arrogance, he thinks, is only dangerous when it silences curiosity, and amnesia only tragic when it denies shared ancestry. The solution is neither surrender nor conquest, but dialogue. If myths teach anything, it is that stories survive by conversation. Every text, every creed, is a translation of an older whisper. He moves to the window. Outside, the valley sleeps beneath a thin silver mist. The river glimmers faintly, winding between shadows like liquid glass. Its surface reflects both the moon and the faint glow of the monastery's lamps. Two lights mirrored, neither diminished. He whispers to the dark. Perhaps belief and scholarship are the same river seen from opposite banks. The words hang in the air, weightless, before dissolving into the hush. Behind him, the candle sputters and dies. The room does not fall into complete darkness. A faint luminescence lingers from the moon, turning everything to shades of blue and pewter. The manuscripts shimmer faintly, their surfaces alive with the ghosts of ink. He feels surrounded by centuries of thought, each voice a small lantern flickering against oblivion. He returns to the table and gathers his papers into a single neat stack. At the top, he writes in a slow, deliberate hand: "Rebuttal is not the enemy of wonder." The letters gleam wet in the moonlight. Beneath them he adds, "To question a myth is to keep it breathing." Then he closes the folder and ties it with string. The gesture feels ceremonial, almost devotional. Before leaving the room, he pauses by the shelf of relics: small clay seals, a chipped chalice, a fragment of glazed tile. Each bears marks of hands long vanished. He touches one gently, a seal engraved with a serpent entwined around a star. The texture is cool, smooth in places where centuries of fingers have passed. It feels like shaking hands with time itself. As he steps into the corridor, a draft of night air greets him, scented with myrrh and stone. The monastery is silent but not asleep. Somewhere deep within, water drips into the cistern, a slow, steady heartbeat of continuity. He walks toward his chamber, the faint echo of his boots following behind like a second thought. At the door, he glances back once more toward the library, its doorway glowing faintly under moonlight. In that stillness, he feels the paradox settle inside him. That faith grows, not by agreement, but by persistence through argument. Myths, like rivers, survive by erosion and renewal alike. He smiles, letting the idea rest. The night holds its breath, and the sound of distant thunder murmurs low beyond the mountains, soft as reassurance. Tomorrow, the work will continue. The questions, the bridges, the quiet music of clay and scripture speaking through each other, forever unfinished, forever alive. Dawn returns in silence, thin as breath drawn between centuries. The mist clings low to the ground, wrapping the stone walls of the monastery like folded parchment. The archaeologist descends the narrow stairwell that spirals toward the lower cloister. It is here, beneath the main chapel, that the archives of the old Templar house lie. Chambers carved into bedrock, smelling faintly of iron, wax, and time. This is where the bridge begins, between relic and revelation, between the memory of the clay and the discipline of the sword. He carries a lantern instead of a candle, its flame steady and amber. The light paints his path in gold as he walks through corridors lined with oak shelves, their surfaces scarred by centuries of hands. Dust lies thick, yet undisturbed, as though the air itself has grown protective. At the corridor's end, an iron door stands half open, engraved with a simple emblem: two riders sharing one horse, their cloaks caught in an eternal gust, the symbol of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Templar order. He enters the chamber and sets the lantern on a stone lectern. The space feels different from the upper monastery, colder, hungrier. The walls are lined with parchment rolls, bound in red leather. In one corner, a rack of rusted swords leans against a chest that once travelled through the Levant. The blades glint faintly, their edges dulled yet dignified, like memories refusing to fade. He runs his hand across the metal and feels the faint ripple of engraving. Latin mottos, fragments of psalms, sometimes a single word. Veritas, truth. The air hums with a resonance that is not quite echo. He opens one of the scrolls, its ribbon stiff with age. The Latin text within surprises him. Not a military ledger, but a treatise on the stewardship of knowledge. Templars, it reads, are keepers of two kinds of weapon: steel to defend the body and word to defend the soul. The line sends a small thrill through him. It feels like confirmation of something he has long suspected. That these warriors of faith also saw themselves as custodians of understanding. Their monasteries were not only fortresses, they were libraries disguised as armories. He reads further. The treatise speaks of Jerusalem, of relics brought west not for profit, but for preservation. Fragments of manuscripts from Babylon, Alexandria, Antioch. The Templars had traded not only gold, but stories. Somewhere in their network, beneath their banners, echoes of ancient myths had travelled, disguised as theology, carried by ink instead of coin. He imagines the scene. Knights dismounting at dawn, their armour still crusted with salt and dust, handing scrolls to scribes waiting in the shadow of a chapel. Those scrolls might have held the same lines he studies today. Tiamat, Adamu, Ninti, Atrahasis. Older names passed hand to hand under the sign of the cross. He sits on the stone bench, feeling the cold seep through his coat. The weight of the place settles over him. Every stone seems to whisper with memory. Every glint of metal, a faint echo of distant clangor. He recalls the paradox of these men, sworn to poverty, yet rich in power, guardians of secrecy, yet seekers of truth. In their contradiction, he senses the very bridge his research has been seeking. The Templars lived in the space between war and worship, myth and dogma, much like he lives between history and faith. A faint draught passes through the chamber, fluttering a parchment pinned to the wall. He lifts it down carefully. The script is French, written in a confident, angular hand. What we guard, we do not always understand. Beneath the line, a small red seal of wax bears the imprint of a cross entwined with a serpent. The archaeologist smiles softly. The symbol speaks more honestly than any chronicle. Even within their order, the Templars had wrestled with the same tension that fills his own studies. The boundary between heresy and revelation. He opens another chest and finds inside an assortment of small relics. Bronze keys, prayer beads, a vial of sand labelled Terra Sancta. Among them rests a codex bound in black leather, its spine embossed with faded silver. He lifts it with care, brushing away the thin film of dust. Inside, the Latin script alternates with drawings, maps of Jerusalem, diagrams of temple ruins, and strange marginalia that seem less like notes and more like meditations. One drawing stops him, a hand holding a quill that transforms halfway into a sword. Beneath it, the inscription, Sapiens dominabitur astris, the wise shall rule the stars. He reads it twice, then laughs under his breath. Here, the divide between scholarship and mysticism collapses entirely. He imagines a Templar scribe bent over this same desk centuries ago, copying fragments by torchlight while battle raged miles away. Perhaps he too felt that double calling, the desire to fight and to understand. The archaeologist feels kinship with that long-vanished brother, both of them servants of a mystery that refuses containment. Across time, they share the same quiet vow to keep the bridge standing, even when no one remembers why it was built. He takes a sip of water from his flask and studies the margins again. Notes in red ink speak of a secret archive rumoured to lie beneath the old Temple Mount, a collection of scrolls tracing pre-Christian cosmologies guarded for their potential to illuminate the Word. Whether the archive truly existed or not, he realises, matters less than the intention behind it. The Templars believed knowledge could sanctify as surely as prayer. Perhaps that was their heresy and their holiness alike. A sound interrupts his thought, the slow creak of wood. Somewhere behind him, a door has shifted slightly ajar. He turns, lantern raised, but sees only shadow. Still, he senses presence, not ghostly, but historical. This chamber has held too many whispers to ever be truly silent. He wonders if these walls could remember the debates once spoken here. Monks arguing over texts brought from the East, one calling them dangerous, another insisting they were divine. The air itself feels thick with that tension, a living memory of questions asked and never fully answered. He lowers the lantern and whispers, "You were not wrong to seek." His voice sounds small in the stone hall, but sincere. Perhaps, he thinks, scholarship and faith are both forms of pilgrimage, journeys toward a truth that can never be owned, only approached. On the far wall, an iron crucifix catches the lantern light. Around its base is carved a single Latin word, pontem, bridge. He steps closer, tracing the letters with his finger. Beneath centuries of dust, the word still gleams faintly. It is both message and metaphor, left by hands that understood the fragility of knowledge. He whispers again, the bridge remains. He returns to his bench and begins to copy the inscription into his notebook. The pen glides easily, its scratch blending with the faint drip of water in the background. Each letter feels like a heartbeat. When he finishes, he looks up and realizes how still the room has become. Even the air holds its breath. He imagines the Templars walking these corridors at night, their torches painting halos on the walls, the soft jingle of mail mixing with murmured psalms. To them, the serpent of wisdom and the cross of faith were not enemies, but companions. Dual paths to the same mystery. They were, he realizes, the first true translators of myth into theology, the keepers of convergence. The lantern flickers. Its glow catches the rim of a silver chalice on the table. He lifts it. Inside, etched near the lip, are three small symbols: a star, a serpent, and a bell. The star for knowledge, the serpent for renewal, the bell for remembrance. He traces them slowly, feeling as though the entire story of humankind could be distilled into those three signs. Knowledge gives birth to change. Change demands memory to endure. When he sets the chalice down, the light within it ripples, throwing golden arcs across the chamber ceiling. The moment feels sacramental. In the heart of a vault built for warriors, he feels peace, the kind that comes only when opposites touch. Steel and ink, clay and creed, serpent and cross, all reconciled in quiet understanding. Above him, a faint vibration hums through the stones, the bells for lords, calling the monks to morning prayer. Their voices rise, distant yet clear, threading through the cracks in the floor. The chant swells softly. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the word. He smiles. The bridge continues to hold. He closes the codex, places it back into the chest, and extinguishes the lantern. Darkness folds around him, cool and tender. He can still feel the shape of the bridge within his chest, a line of faith stretched across the gulf of time, steady despite the centuries. As he ascends the stair, the first sliver of sunrise cuts across the corridor, striking the rusted blades and making them gleam once more, as if the old brothers had just polished them for a journey yet unfinished. The world above awaits, and so does the next revelation. Somewhere between myth's murmur and history's measured breath, the morning light enters like a hush after prayer, cool and fragile, seeping through the narrow windows of the upper library. Dust floats in the air, each mote a drifting ember of memory. The archaeologist has slept little. His mind is filled with visions from the crypt below, the blades, the scrolls, the strange seal of serpent and cross. That emblem lingers in his thoughts as he climbs the spiral stair, feeling the roughness of stone beneath his palm. He knows now where the bridge leads next, not toward relics of steel, but toward symbols of spirit. The chapter that follows belongs to the ancient dialogue between earth and the divine feminine, between the sacred tree and the woman who stood beneath it. He steps into the scriptorium, where morning sun spills across the long tables. Here, monks once painted the margins of Bibles with vines and stars, turning scripture into garden. The smell of old pigment still lingers. Ochre, malachite, lapis. On the table before him lies a manuscript from the early 14th century. Its edges frayed, its cover embossed with lilies. The title page bears a Latin inscription, De Arbore Sapientiae, on the tree of wisdom. He opens it carefully, and the first illumination greets him. A tree with roots in the sea, its branches holding birds and serpents, and beside it, a woman crowned not with thorns, but with leaves. Her name, the marginal note reads, is Lilith. The image is exquisite. Her hair flows like ink, her gaze calm and knowing. At her feet coils a serpent with wings, not menacing, but protective. The monk who painted this must have known the older stories. The ones whispered before the scriptures hardened into hierarchy. The archaeologist studies the figure in silence, struck by her serenity. Here is no demon, no temptress cast from heaven's grace, but a guardian of hidden understanding. He remembers the texts of Sumer and Akkad, where the sacred grove was the dwelling of Inanna, Ishtar, and Nin-Hersag, goddesses of fertility, wisdom, and sovereignty. The tree was the spine of creation, and woman its mirror, the vessel through which knowledge flowed. Yet in the later scriptures, that same image becomes danger. The tree becomes forbidden, the woman disobedient, the serpent deceptive. The world, it seems, has always feared what it first adored. He writes in his notebook, the feminine divine did not vanish. She was translated into silence. The line settles heavily on the page. He thinks of how myths are like rivers redirected, still flowing, but underground. Lilith, Eve, Inanna, Sophia, all names for the same current of understanding that refused to dry. He remembers a phrase from a suppressed Templar letter he once read in another archive. She who knows must be veiled, lest the blind curse the light. Even the knights, armoured in masculine devotion, had sensed the absence left by the loss of the goddess. They carried her symbols quietly, the rose, the cup, the vine, hidden within their stone churches like secret prayers. The archaeologist rises and walks to the window. Outside, the forest stirs under the wind. The trees sway with a rhythm older than language, their leaves murmuring in tones that seem almost articulate. He watches the sunlight tremble on the branches and imagines that somewhere, unseen, Lilith's breath still moves through them. The tree in the manuscript, the garden of myth, the forests of the world, all are reflections of the same sacred pattern, knowledge reaching upward from the roots of mystery. He returns to the table and opens another page. This illumination shows Eve beneath the tree, the serpent twined around a bough like a question mark of silver. Her hand is outstretched, not in greed, but in wonder. The fruit gleams, half gold, half shadow. The caption beneath reads, Cognitio est lux et ruina. Knowledge is both light and fall. The monks, he realizes, knew what they were doing. Their art spoke what their sermons could not. The serpent's coil around the branch is not a snare, but a path, a spiral of awakening. To eat was not to betray, but to begin. He recalls the teachings of the early mystics who interpreted the fall as a necessary descent, the breaking open of innocence so that consciousness might be born. The Templars, too, kept writings that hinted at this duality. One parchment described the cross as the tree reborn, each arm a branch pointing to the 4 rivers of Eden. In their hidden theology, Christ and the goddess were not opposites, but mirrors, the healer and the womb, the seed and the soil. Each needed the other for resurrection to mean anything at all. The archaeologist's hand trembles slightly as he turns the next page. The illumination is startling. The tree of Eden transformed into a crucifix, its trunk alive with leaves. At its base stands a woman cloaked in blue, one hand raised as if to bless. The inscription beneath her feet reads simply, Mater Sapientia, Mother of Wisdom. He exhales slowly. In this image, centuries of conflict dissolve. The artist has joined all the symbols into one. Eve and Mary, Lilith and Sophia, the forbidden and the divine. The cycle has closed. He sits back, feeling the hush around him deepen. Dust motes spin through the light, tiny planets circling an invisible sun. He can almost hear the sound of brushes against parchment, the whisper of quills tracing veins on painted leaves. The monks who worked here were not rebels. They were translators of silence, turning forbidden reverence into beauty that could survive scrutiny. Through colour and symbol, they kept the goddess alive. He writes another line in his notebook. When myth is suppressed, it becomes art. The ink pools slightly before drying. He glances at the margins of the manuscript again and finds faint notes in a different hand, likely added later. The serpent speaks, but we forgot how to listen. The sentence pierces him. He thinks of modern interpretations that see only punishment where once there was invitation. Perhaps the serpent's whisper was not seduction, but calling, a reminder that divinity dwells in awareness, not obedience. Outside, a gust of wind presses against the windows, rattling them softly. The sound mingles with the murmur of leaves, as if the forest itself were repeating the forgotten conversation. He imagines Eve and Lilith walking together beneath those trees, 2 shadows merging into one. No rivalry, no blame, only recognition. The serpent slides between them, glinting like liquid wisdom. In this vision, the garden is no longer a site of exile, but of reunion. Knowledge and innocence coexist, like night and dawn sharing the same horizon. He returns to his chair, heart calm but awake. The Templar bridge, he realizes, was never built solely from theology or conquest. It was also made from this quiet preservation of symbols that the world deemed dangerous. Within their fortresses, the knights had sheltered the forbidden feminine not by name, but by image, embedding her presence in architecture, geometry, and song. Every rose window in Europe, every chalice lifted at Mass, every vine carved into stone is a memory of the tree they once cut down. He takes one last look at the illumination of the crowned woman beside the serpent. Her eyes seem to meet his, unblinking, ancient, forgiving. The candle beside him flickers, and for an instant the gold leaf in her halo glows as though lit from within. He feels gratitude welling quietly, not as revelation, but as release. The myths are no longer fragments scattered across ages. They are breathing again, connected through the bridge of human yearning. The bells ring for vespers, soft and resonant, calling the monks to evening prayer. Their chant rises through the corridors, a low hum that seems to blend with the rustle of the forest outside. He closes the manuscript gently, running his fingers along its cover. "You survived," he whispers. "Even silence could not erase you." As he stands, the last light of sunset filters through the windows, turning the library gold. The glow touches the manuscripts, the vines, the dust, each detail shimmering like memory reborn. He walks toward the door, each step echoing softly in the vast room. Beyond the threshold waits the long hall lined with candle sconces, leading down toward the chapel. There, beneath arches carved with vines and stars, he can already hear the choir beginning a hymn. The words reach him faintly. Lux perennis, sapientia, vivens. Eternal light, living wisdom. He smiles, understanding now that this is the same song the earth has been singing since the first tree reached toward the sky. As he descends into the gathering dusk, the refrain follows him, mingling with the hush of leaves and the sigh of the evening wind. A hymn both to the heavens and to the roots that hold them. Night thickens around the monastery like velvet drawn across the sky. A silver moon climbs slowly behind the cypress trees, and the bells of Compline fade into a hush that feels almost sacred. In the cloister garden, the air smells of rosemary and rain. The archaeologist walks its stone path, lantern in hand, its warm light pooling around his feet. He has just left the scriptorium where the goddess's image smiled from the pages. Now his thoughts turn toward the mortal echoes of that lost divinity, the bloodlines, the rumours, the stories that claim to carry her pulse forward into history. Beneath the Templar sigils and beneath every royal crest, he senses an older rhythm, a secret inheritance whispered across generations. He enters a small annex attached to the chapter house, a room lined with genealogical charts painted on parchment the colour of bone. The monks call it Camera Sanguinis, the chamber of blood. He sets his lantern on the table and studies the web of names illuminated by its glow. Kings, queens, abbots, and warriors connected by threads of ink. Some names he knows from chronicles, others from legend. At the centre, drawn in faded vermilion, is a sigil unlike the rest, a simple line ending in a coiled spiral. Beneath it, the words Ordo Merovingius. He breathes softly. The Merovingians, those long-haired kings of early medieval Gaul, rumoured descendants of a divine or sacred line. History calls them the first dynasty of France. Myth calls them something stranger, heirs of an ancient covenant, custodians of knowledge older than the church itself. The Templars, according to certain sealed letters, believed their founder, Hugues de Payan, had sworn to protect the remnants of that lineage. Some even claimed that the blood of those kings was tied to relics the knights guarded, the Grail, the Ark, or something less tangible, a gene of memory, a spark of sacred wisdom. He touches the spiral symbol lightly. The parchment is brittle, but the ink still glimmers faintly, as though mixed with powdered gold. He recalls an inscription he once read in a sealed codex, recovered from a Templar commandery near Poitiers. The river of wisdom flows through blood, not throne. The line has haunted him for years. Perhaps it was never meant biologically. Perhaps blood was a metaphor for continuity. Ideas transmitted through devotion, vision, and sacrifice, rather than through veins. He sits at the table and unrolls a scroll tied with blue ribbon. Its script is in Old Occitan, the language of troubadours and secret orders. The text tells of a woman named Alice, said to be of Merovingian descent, who fled persecution carrying with her a sealed chest. The chest, the story says, contained neither gold nor relics, but a parchment that told of beginnings older than Babel. The scroll ends abruptly, the rest torn away. The archaeologist leans back, heart beating faster. Could it be another retelling of the same myth? Adam, Eve, the serpent, preserved through song and bloodline alike. He imagines the woman moving through dark forests, moonlight glancing off her cloak, the chest bound against her heart. Around her, wolves howl and rivers shimmer like threads of mercury. In her hands, she holds not wealth, but remembrance. The vision feels strangely intimate, as though she were a messenger walking out of the myths themselves. Perhaps the true inheritance of the Merovingians was not genetic, but spiritual. The duty to carry the story unbroken, to ensure the bridge between the divine and human remained intact. He rises and crosses to another table where relics rest beneath glass. Among them lies a small ring, silver, its face engraved with a star, and beneath it, 3 small dots forming a triangle. The inscription reads, Rex Crinatus, the long-haired king. In the chronicles, the Merovingian rulers were described as wearing their hair like a crown, never cut, for to shear it was to strip them of power. The archaeologist studies the ring, thinking how hair itself is a thread, living, growing, enduring after death. It is a perfect emblem of continuity. The monks who preserved this relic must have sensed its symbolism. Strength not as conquest, but as persistence, the kind that grows silently, invisibly, yet cannot be severed without consequence. He opens a leather-bound codex beside the relic case. Its pages are filled with sketches. Templar knights kneeling before figures cloaked in royal blue. A chalice emitting light. A woman standing behind the throne, her hands resting on the ruler's shoulders. Beneath one illustration, in neat Latin, is written, Sanguis est verbum incarnatum. Blood is the word made flesh. The phrase chills him. In its daring poetry, it blurs the line between theology and biology. He copies it into his journal and adds a note. Perhaps myth clothed itself in lineage to survive theology's blade. Outside, wind moves through the cloister arches, carrying the faint sigh of the sea. Though the coast lies far away, the sound reminds him that every legend of bloodline begins near water, rivers, wells, baptismal fonts, the flow of time itself. He remembers how earlier in his journey, the clay tablets of Mesopotamia spoke of life moulded from wet earth, and how every generation since has reimagined that wetness as sacred. Water, blood, ink. They are all media of transmission. They carry story as surely as veins carry breath. He walks to the far end of the chamber, where an ancient tapestry hangs. Its colours are faded, but its pattern is intricate. A red river flowing from a tree whose roots are entwined with serpents. Along the river's banks stand armoured figures, their swords lowered, their faces uplifted toward a star shining above the tree. It is both battlefield and sanctuary, conflict and communion. In the corner, woven in tiny gold thread, appear two letters, M and T, Merovingius and Temple. The archaeologist traces the fabric with his fingertips, the texture soft yet rough, like memory refusing to decay. He thinks of the contradictions that bind the story together. A monastic order sworn to chastity, yet guarding a legend of blood. Knights of faith preserving pagan symbolism. The church itself built upon the foundations of older gods. Each paradox feels less like deceit and more like inevitability. Human understanding, he muses, cannot climb toward light without gripping the roots of darkness. The bridge is always built from opposites. He sits again and writes, the ink flowing steady despite his fatigue. Every myth demands caretakers, he notes. The Templars and the Merovingians, each a chapter of stewardship. The first guarded relics, the second guarded remembrance. Both kept alive what orthodoxy feared, that divinity might live among us, not above. He pauses, hearing his own words echo faintly against the walls. The lantern flickers low. Shadows stretch across the parchment, merging with the ink until distinction blurs. He feels as though he is writing not history, but confession, a confession that spans centuries, signed by countless unseen hands. The air grows cooler, scented with old linen and dust. Somewhere nearby, a floorboard creaks as though answering his thoughts. He lifts his head and gazes at the relic case once more. The silver ring glints faintly in the dim light, a spark of continuity. He imagines the ancient kings kneeling in dim chapels, their hair uncut, their prayers whispered to both Christ and something older, a goddess, a river, a memory. They would not have named it heresy, only reverence. He feels a sudden tenderness for them, for their bewildering sincerity. Power, for them, had been responsibility, to remember, to preserve. The clock strikes midnight. Its sound rolls through the corridors, like a slow heartbeat. He gathers his notes carefully, wrapping the scroll in linen, extinguishing the lantern until only moonlight remains. The room glows faintly silver, and in that half-light, the tapestry seems to shimmer. The tree's river pulsing as if alive. He smiles at the illusion, unwilling to dismiss it entirely. As he steps into the courtyard, the air is cool and wet with dew. Above him, the moon is bright enough to cast shadows of leaves on the stones. He looks toward the chapel's tower, where the Templar cross catches the light. It gleams faintly, neither wholly red nor white, but something between. A colour of transition, of bridgework. He realizes that blood, too, is such a colour. Both sacrifice and life, both past and promise. He whispers to the quiet sky. The line continues, not through crowns, but through memory. The wind answers softly, moving through the rosemary and the ivy like breath through hair. As he turns toward his cell, the thought steadies him. The story will endure, as all stories do, hidden in blood, in stone, in sound. Somewhere in its pulse lies the same vow that guided the Templars and the kings alike, to keep the flame of meaning alive while the world forgets. Behind him, in the dark of the camera sanguinis, the last spark of the lantern fades. Yet for a heartbeat before it dies, the silver ring gleams again, catching a moonlight through the crack of the door, a quiet echo of lineage, of myth breathing through the generations. The bridge of remembrance holding firm beneath the weight of time. The morning begins without sound. A pale haze lies over the valley, and the first light drifts into the monastery like smoke from a dying candle. The archaeologist wakes before the bells. his body still heavy from the long night among relics and genealogies. He lies for a moment in the narrow bed, staring at the beams above him, feeling the faint pulse of the world through the stone floor, the slow rhythm of age itself. There is a calmness in him now, the hush that follows revelation. But revelation, he knows, is only the threshold. The greater task is to understand what it means to live with what has been uncovered. He dresses quietly and walks through the corridor to the garden cloister. Dew coats the grass in beads of silver, and a thin mist curls around the arches like silk. He sits by the central fountain, its water murmuring the same melody it has sung for centuries. The birds have not yet begun their chorus. The air holds only the whisper of running water and the faint chime of distant bells. The quiet seems to invite contemplation, and he feels words begin to gather in his mind, not of myth, but of consequence. He takes out his notebook, its pages swollen slightly from humidity. On the first blank sheet, he writes a heading: 3 threads: authority, knowledge, nature. The ink bleeds slightly into the paper, forming soft halos around the letters. These, he knows, are the cords that have bound human civilization since the first clay was pressed by hand. Who rules, who understands, and who listens to the earth? The old myths were not only stories, they were blueprints for these 3 relationships: the serpent, the tree, the flood, all metaphors for balance, all warning signs of what happens when that balance breaks. He writes slowly, the words forming between breaths. The age of myth ended, he notes, but its architecture remained. Authority became law, knowledge became science, nature became resource. Each was stripped of its spirit, and in their separation, we inherited the illusion of control. The fountain gurgles beside him, as if in gentle agreement. He looks at its circular pool, seeing how its ripples expand and vanish, how every movement leaves a trace before being swallowed again. That, he thinks, is how influence works. Every action, like every myth, radiates outward until absorbed by the next generation's silence. A soft wind rises through the cloister. The cypress trees sway, and the scent of resin fills the air. He recalls how the old Sumerian and Hebrew stories had used water as a moral boundary, a test of humility. To control it was to risk arrogance. To respect it was to live. Now, millennia later, humanity commands rivers and floods through dams and algorithms, yet thirst remains. The more the world claims mastery over nature, the further it drifts from communion. Perhaps, he muses, the ancient authors understood something we have forgotten, that harmony with the world was never achieved through conquest, but through kinship. He turns another page. The ink on his fingers smudges faintly. Authority, he writes, was born when one voice claimed to speak for the gods. He pauses, remembering the tablets where many gods had quarrelled like family, each representing a facet of nature's will. That pluralism allowed dialogue, compromise. When monotheism arrived, dialogue turned to decree. From divine order came hierarchy. From hierarchy, obedience. He does not write these thoughts as accusation, but as observation. A pattern visible across ages. Authority without humility, like flood without banks, drowns everything it touches. The sun rises higher now, gilding the cloister arches. Monks move silently through the corridor, their robes brushing the floor like whispers of fabric. One nods to him, eyes gentle. He nods back, realizing that even here, in this sanctuary of faith, hierarchy and devotion coexist like 2 sides of the same chalice. The problem is not power, he thinks, but forgetting that power is borrowed. The Templars had understood this briefly. Their code required each knight to serve first before commanding. Perhaps that is why they fell. Not from sin, but from their reminder that authority without service is hollow. He dips his pen again, adding another note. Knowledge is the twin of humility. One withers without the other. The phrase reminds him of Eve, her hand outstretched toward the fruit. In every retelling, the pursuit of knowledge carries both promise and peril. Yet in suppressing her act, later ages taught fear of inquiry. He thinks of scholars burned, books hidden, languages silenced. The serpent of curiosity was recast as devil, and humanity learned to distrust its own questions. But now, in the modern age, curiosity is returned without reverence. Knowledge has grown vast, untempered by wisdom. Machines dream without souls. Data multiplies without mercy. We have eaten the fruit again, but this time we do not know how to digest it. The fountain bubbles louder as a breeze ripples its surface. He stares at his reflection, distorted, trembling. The image of himself seems made of water and light, fragile and impermanent. Nature, he writes, is the last mirror. When we destroy it, we lose the image of ourselves. The ancient myths treated earth and sky as partners in divine marriage. The fall of Adam and Eve, the wrath of the flood, even the serpent's whisper, all were metaphors for broken dialogue between humanity and creation. The ground beneath us has memory, he realizes. The same clay that formed Adamu forms the walls of our cities. The same breath that animated the first garden still stirs the wind through the pines. If we forget that kinship, every invention becomes an elegy. The monk's chant begins somewhere beyond the courtyard, low, resonant, weaving through the morning air. The sound fills the space between his thoughts. He feels its rhythm sync with the pulse of his heart. Steady, solemn, he closes his eyes and listens. The chant is not unlike the ancient hymns of Enuma Elish or the Psalms of David, human voices seeking balance between awe and understanding. Perhaps, he thinks, that is the secret thread running through every age, the effort to harmonize knowledge with reverence, to let wisdom temper the hunger for control. He opens his eyes again, noticing how the sunlight now dances across the fountain's ripples. He takes a breath and writes one last line beneath his notes. Authority must learn empathy. Knowledge must remember silence. Nature must be treated as kin. The sentence feels like a prayer disguised as conclusion. He sits quietly for a long time, the pages of his notebook open beside him, the air around him vibrating with chant and birdsong. The world feels at peace for the first time in days, yet under that peace lies a question, steady as heartbeat. Can humanity rebuild the bridge it once broke? The bridge between creation and conscience? He thinks of the Templar motto carved into the crypt wall. Pontem tenemus. We hold the bridge. Perhaps that duty is simply passed on, unspoken, to those who still seek connection in a divided world. A butterfly flutters above the fountain, its wings catching sunlight like fragments of stained glass. He watches it land on the water's edge, delicate, weightless. For a moment, the entire world seems to balance on that trembling line between fragility and grace. Then the wings lift, scattering droplets that sparkle like blessings. He closes his notebook, pressing his palm against its cover as if sealing a promise. Around him, the cloister hums with quiet life. Monks tending gardens, bees tracing loops among the lavender, the distant toll of a bell calling the world to wakefulness. He feels the threads of authority, knowledge and nature intertwine, not as burdens, but as harmonies waiting to be remembered. He stands, stretching his back, and takes one last look at the fountain. The ripples widen, catching the morning sun until it looks like molten gold. He smiles softly, knowing that soon his study will take him beyond these walls, into the world where these ideas must breathe. For now, he lets the calm fill him, grounding him in the present. As he leaves the garden, the sound of the fountain fades behind him, replaced by the whisper of wind through the arches. It sounds like an echo from another age, a reminder that water, earth, and breath are older than any word for divinity. The world keeps speaking, softly, patiently, to anyone still willing to listen. The afternoon unfolds slowly, its light slanting through high windows in long amber bands. The monastery hums with quiet labour, tools clinking in the garden, footsteps echoing down stone corridors, the faint creak of wood expanding under the sun. The archaeologist walks toward the west wing, where an old classroom adjoins the refectory. It was once a scriptorium for novice monks, later turned into a study hall for pilgrims and scholars. Dust clings to every beam, yet the air holds the faint smell of chalk and parchment, a scent that always reminds him of new beginnings. On a table by the window rest two small wooden boxes, each marked with a faded inscription. Cabin A and Cabin B. The abbot had told him that these boxes contained teaching materials, objects once used by the monks to explain scripture to children and visitors. Curious, he opens the first box. Inside lie fragments of clay, some moulded into tiny figures, others shaped like tablets with shallow markings. A folded sheet of parchment accompanies them, its ink browned with age. The heading reads, Adamu et pulvis, Adam and dust. He smiles. The monks had taught Genesis through touch, not only through voice. He lifts one of the clay figures, feeling its texture, gritty, uneven, yet somehow warm. A faint thumbprint remains visible where the maker pressed too hard centuries ago. Beneath the figure lies another inscription. Formatus est homo de terra viventis. Man was formed from living earth. He sets the piece on the table and realizes that this little classroom, forgotten and silent, once carried the same lessons as the tablets he studied in far-off archives. Knowledge, he thinks, has never truly left the clay. It has simply changed its language. He moves to the second box. Inside, he finds a small glass vial sealed with wax and labelled Jardinum. Within it floats a few dried leaves, perhaps olive or fig, and a fragment of bark. A parchment beneath explains its purpose, a sensory exercise used by the monks. Students were told to open the vial, smell the leaves, and imagine the Garden of Eden as something real and earthly. The exercise was meant to remind them that paradise was not a distant abstraction, but an intimacy between humans and nature. He unscrews the cap and inhales. The scent is faint, almost gone, yet something remains. Sunlight, dust, and the ghost of green. He sits by the window, placing both boxes before him. Through the glass, he can see the monastery's garden, rows of lavender and rosemary bordered by apple trees, their leaves stirring in the breeze. Beyond them, the hills glow in gold. He realizes the monks had built this classroom to mirror that view. Their lesson was not escape, but reflection. Learn from what surrounds you. He thinks of children tracing letters on wax tablets, while the wind carried the scent of apples through the windows. Education here had been sensory, tender, grounded in the body's memory. He takes out his notebook and writes, "Knowledge should be tactile. Wisdom begins in the skin." The sentence surprises him. He had spent years buried in texts, yet these small relics remind him that understanding begins not in archives, but in breath, in texture, in shared space. Perhaps that is why myth endures. It engages every sense. When the ancients told stories of clay, fire, and water, They were teaching through the body what theology later confined to mind. He opens a drawer beneath the table and finds another document, a short teaching journal by an anonymous monk. The handwriting is soft, rounded, patient. One entry reads, "Today we planted the new sapling in the children's garden. They call it Eden's Echo." Another entry, "When it blooms, they will learn the lesson of cycles, loss and return." He can almost see them, a group of young novices crouched in the soil, planting with solemn care. The lesson was not symbolic, it was physical, immediate. To plant was to understand resurrection. He decides to step outside to see if any trace of that children's garden remains. The path behind the west wing leads to a small, walled enclosure. Inside, the ground is uneven, but in one corner a single tree stands. Old, gnarled, its trunk twisted into the shape of a spiral. Its branches still bear a few small apples, green tinged with red. He kneels beside its roots and touches the bark. It is rough, cool, alive. The tree hums faintly with bees moving among the blossoms. He imagines that the monks must have tended it for generations, passing its care from teacher to pupil, each adding a layer of devotion to the soil. He picks up a fallen apple, small and bruised, and turns it in his hand. The skin glows like varnished gold. He cuts it open with his pocket knife, revealing a star of seeds within. For a moment, he feels the world collapse into perfect symmetry. The tree of knowledge, the seed of renewal, the fruit of teaching. He realizes this garden, modest and unremarkable, may be the truest continuation of the myths he has studied. Here, the story is not written. It is lived. Sitting under the tree, he opens his notebook again. "The sacred returns through practice," he writes. When myth becomes action, belief becomes kindness. He remembers the way the Templars once divided their days between battle and cultivation, tending vineyards as carefully as they tended arms. Perhaps that dual devotion, discipline and nurturing, was their greatest inheritance. He wonders what would happen if modern education followed that model, teaching history through planting, philosophy through tending animals, theology through the rhythm of sunrise and soil. The wind stirs again, shaking loose a few petals from the tree's blossoms. They drift down onto his pages, pale pink against white paper. He lets them rest there, unwilling to brush them away. Each petal is a note from the living world, a reminder that learning begins with noticing. He looks toward the hills and imagines another kind of classroom, a modern one. He sees a small school on the edge of a city, its courtyard paved but cracked by weeds finding sunlight. In one cabin, children sit around a table covered with clay, their hands shaping small figures as a teacher tells them the story of the first people moulded from earth. In another cabin, older students study water samples, learning of floods both ancient and present, tracing patterns between mythology and climate. The hum of their laughter fills the air, and outside, a small tree grows beside the fence, its branches supported by a wooden brace. Someone has hung a bell from its limb, and when the wind blows, the bell rings softly, echoing the old monasteries and older stories alike. He smiles at the vision. It feels both possible and necessary. The world, he thinks, has always needed such bridges, places where knowledge meets reverence. The monks of old knew that study was not escape from the world, but return to it. Perhaps that is the wisdom our time must relearn, that the divine speaks through the ordinary, through every act of careful attention. The sun tilts westward, the light deepening to amber. He gathers the boxes, returning the clay figures and the small vial to their places. Before closing the lid, he adds one of the fallen petals, pressing it gently between the pages of the parchment. The scent of apple and dust rises again, mingling with the faint sweetness of wax from his candle. He leaves the classroom door ajar so the last light can enter. Outside, the air is warm and full of sound. The distant chanting of evening prayer, the flutter of birds returning to the eaves, the low murmur of bees in the lavender. He walks slowly through the corridor, the notebook under his arm. For the first time, the world feels whole again. Myth and practice, spirit and body, thought and soil joined in quiet harmony. As he passes the cloister arch, he pauses to listen to the bell that hangs there. Its note rings low, carrying across the courtyard toward the hills. The sound lingers long after the echo fades, like the aftertaste of memory. He smiles, murmuring to himself. Even the smallest lessons echo forever. Then he turns toward the library, ready to record this day, not as discovery, but as gratitude, an offering written in the margin of the living world. Evening settles like silk soaked in gold, each ray of light stretched thin across the monastery walls. The day's warmth lingers in the stones, and the air carries a sweetness of thyme and wax from the chapel candles. The archaeologist stands once more in the cloister garden, where the first shadows of dusk begin to lengthen. He knows this night will not be spent in study, nor in the vaults below. Tonight is for reflection, for laying down the weight of discovery without letting it scatter into forgetfulness. The bridge he has traced, from clay to scripture, from Templar halls to modern earth, feels complete, yet fragile, like a fresco still drying. To preserve it, he must let the voices of debate and devotion speak together, one last time. He takes his notebook and walks to the cloister bench beneath the old fig tree. The leaves stir faintly in the wind, their undersides flashing silver. From this spot, he can see the chapel door and, beyond it, the open valley descending into dusk. The sound of the monks chanting vespers floats through the arches, a rhythm slow as the heartbeat of time. He opens his notebook to a clean page, the paper smelling faintly of apple blossom and ink. At the top he writes, "Reconciliation of voices." Then he waits, listening for the thoughts that arrive not from reason, but from stillness. For months he has followed the footprints of myths across epochs, Sumerian rivers, Hebrew deserts, Templar corridors, and everywhere he found echoes of the same question. Where does revelation end and remembrance begin? Scholars have asked it in lectures, believers in prayer, skeptics in silence. Now, in the fading light, he feels them all gather around him like invisible companions. Their disagreements no longer clash, they form a circle. He remembers the old phrase carved above the Templar altar, veritas in colloquio, truth in conversation. He writes the words again in his notebook, underlining them slowly. Debate is not division, he murmurs. It is devotion in motion. The words feel right. Each voice, even those that oppose, sustains the bridge by testing its strength. He recalls the Babylonian scribes, their styluses tapping wet clay with certainty, the exiled Hebrews reworking those patterns into new faith, the medieval monks copying with trembling reverence, the modern skeptics, their microscopes and carbon dating replacing the oracle. None are wrong, not entirely. All of them, knowingly or not, are translators of awe. He flips backward through his notes, pages of diagrams, sketches, transcriptions. The inked words seem to shimmer in the fading light, sentences written weeks apart now meeting like rivers joining in one delta. He pauses on a line from the earlier section. To question a myth is to keep it breathing. He underlines it twice. That, he realizes, is the very heartbeat of continuity. Every generation that doubts also renews. Belief that cannot bear inquiry becomes fossil. Inquiry that forgets reverence becomes emptiness. The world survives in the dialogue between the two. The wind rises gently, lifting a few loose petals from the fig tree. They swirl around his feet like fragments of unwritten scripture. He watches them dance and thinks of Eve beneath the tree, of the serpent's whisper, of the flood's quiet aftermath. All of it, knowledge and consequence, fall and renewal, returns here, into this simple rhythm of leaf and air. The old texts were right. Understanding is both light and burden, yet perhaps burden itself is sacred, a sign that the soul is still listening. A faint chime rings from the chapel, a signal that compline will soon begin. He imagines the monks gathering inside, their chants soon to drift through the dusk. For a moment, he envies them, their certainty, their ritual, but then he realizes that his work is simply another form of liturgy. Instead of chanting psalms, he arranges stories. Instead of bread and wine, he offers context and care. The gesture is the same. The sacred, after all, is not confined to the altar. It appears wherever attention becomes prayer. He looks to the valley, now dimming to indigo. Beyond the fields lies the faint shimmer of a river, perhaps the same one that once flooded, now flowing peacefully beneath the moon. He thinks of all the scholars and dreamers who have stood before such water, each seeing something different. Punishment, renewal, symbol, fact. Truth has always been a river, its surface never still. To claim it fully is to freeze it. To follow it is to stay alive. He turns another page and begins writing a letter. Not to a person, but to the bridge itself. You were never meant to be finished, he writes. You exist to carry meaning forward, plank by plank, across uncertainty. He tells the bridge about the archaeologists who doubt, the priests who defend, the artists who reinterpret, and the children who plant trees in remembrance of a garden no one has seen. You bind them all, he continues. Without you, knowledge is noise and faith is fear. He pauses, noticing the tremor of his handwriting. The air has cooled. The lantern he brought flickers faintly beside him. He pulls his coat tighter and rereads the letter aloud. The words sound fragile, almost embarrassed, but their sincerity steadies him. He tears the page from the notebook, folds it, and places it between the stones of the bench. A small offering to the silence, an acknowledgement that not every truth needs an audience. From the chapel comes the first line of the night's hymn, voices rising in unison. The melody floats over the courtyard, finding him where he sits. He closes his eyes. The chant carries no doctrine, only vibration, a hum that feels as old as the clay tablets, as young as breath. He imagines the sound travelling outward, across the valley, across continents, reaching every soul who has ever searched for meaning in the dark. He opens his eyes and speaks softly into the twilight, as though addressing unseen listeners. To those who defend, keep your faith gentle. To those who question, keep your wonder kind. To those who teach, remember the garden. To those who despair, remember the flood's end. His voice trembles slightly, but the air seems to hold it, not as command, but as invitation. For a moment, he feels utterly present, both scholar and supplicant, human and echo. The wind shifts, bringing the scent of lavender and the faint salt of distant sea. He imagines that somewhere beyond the horizon, others are also looking at the same moon, perhaps whispering their own reconciliations. The idea comforts him. Myths were never owned. They were shared weather systems of the soul. They drift. They reign. They rise again. He takes one last look at his notes, then closes the notebook. The sky above has turned cobalt, and the first star appears, trembling like a tear of light. He feels the day's questions settle into quiet acceptance, not resolution, just peace. To continue asking is enough. He rises from the bench and walks toward the cloister arch. Behind him, the fig leaves rustle, the petals scatter, the river glimmers faintly below. Everything feels in conversation, the world murmuring to itself through countless dialects of faith and reason. He reaches the chapel door but does not enter. Instead, he stands in its threshold, watching the candles flicker inside. Each flame bows slightly in the air's invisible breath. He whispers, "Thank you for holding." It is unclear whether he speaks to the bridge, to the monks, or to time itself. Perhaps to all three. The chant swells one last time, then fades into the steady rhythm of the world's own heartbeat. As he turns away, the moonlight falls across the courtyard, painting the stones in silver. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird calls once, sharp and clear, then quiets. The archaeologist walks back toward his cell, the echo of the hymn following him like a benediction. The night holds him gently, neither demanding nor explaining. Tomorrow, he will write again. But for now, the words can rest. The bridge stands. The dialogue continues. The silence, too, has earned its voice. Night has deepened into something softer than darkness, a slow exhale of time. The monastery sleeps, yet the air hums faintly, as though stone, wood, and leaf are breathing together. The valley below glimmers under a pale veil of mist, and the moon hangs low, swollen and patient, its reflection trembling in the fountain's pool. Inside his small cell, the archaeologist sits beside a single candle, its flame a fragile island of gold amid the stillness. Before him lies the final page of his notebook, blank except for one line at the top. Wind down, the bridge's end. He stares at it for a long moment, feeling both weight and release. All day, his thoughts have moved between past and present, history and hope. Until now they have settled into quiet alignment. The world no longer feels divided between faith and fact. It feels like one long breath moving through generations. He closes his eyes and listens. Outside, the sound of the river threads through the air, a low rhythmic murmur like pages turning in an unseen book. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls once, its note fading into the trees. The candle crackles, and for an instant, the flame bends as though bowing to that nocturnal hymn. He takes a deep breath. The wax smells faintly of honey and smoke, and beneath it, a trace of salt from the sea wind that creeps inland through the valley. The scent reminds him of every landscape he has studied. The floodplains of Mesopotamia, the deserts of Judea, the cloisters of Europe, all of them layered like verses of the same prayer. He begins to write, his pen whispering softly across the page. Every story returns to the earth, he writes, and every truth ends where silence begins. The words are simple, yet they feel like the sum of everything he has uncovered. Beneath the monuments of scholarship, beneath the arguments of theologians and skeptics alike, there is the same trembling desire to understand why we are here and what remains when we are gone. That desire, he thinks, is the oldest myth of all. The serpent, the flood, the gods, the knights, all are metaphors for that hunger to connect, to reach across the void and feel another heartbeat echo back. He rises and walks to the window. The moonlight spills across the floor, silvering the rough stones. Beyond the garden wall, the forest sways slowly in the night wind, each branch moving as though remembering a forgotten rhythm. He imagines that if one could listen closely enough, one might still hear the first song of creation, the vibration that stirred water and dust into form. The monks believed that the world hums with divine frequency, a tone so low it becomes silence. The thought comforts him. Perhaps the bridge he has been tracing all this time is not built of knowledge or faith, but of resonance, the shared hum that unites what words divide. He thinks of the Templars who once prayed in these halls, warriors, mystics, scribes. They too must have felt this hum when the world fell quiet. Their armour, now rusted, once sang when struck by the wind. Their chants, echoing through cathedrals, were as rhythmic as the beating of oars across mythic floods. They built bridges of their own, between Jerusalem and Paris, between relic and reason, between war and wonder. And though their order fell, its echo persists. Within this monastery, within every seeker who still believes that preservation is an act of faith. He looks down at the courtyard, where the fountain gleams like a mirror of the sky. Its surface ripples gently, disturbed by a single leaf falling from the fig tree. He watches the concentric circles widen, merge, then fade. It feels like a parable. Every discovery, every generation, every life begins as a small disturbance upon eternity's calm. We widen outward, touching others, until we dissolve into the larger stillness. Yet even when the ripples vanish, the memory of motion remains within the water. That, he thinks, is immortality, the trace that endures after the noise is gone. Returning to the desk, he adds another line to his page. To know is to remember, but to remember is to love. It feels almost too sentimental for an academic notebook. But tonight, he no longer separates emotion from thought. Myth, after all, was never sterile. It was sung, not cited. The ancients told their stories not to prove, but to console. He dips the pen again, the ink glistening like midnight glass, and continues. The bridge is built not of certainty, but of tenderness, the willingness to walk toward one another despite the fog. The candle burns lower. Shadows stretch across the wall like long fingers of smoke. His eyes grow heavy, yet he keeps writing, not with urgency, but with calm necessity, as if the act itself completes a circle begun thousands of years ago. In the beginning, he writes, we shaped gods from clay because we recognized our own fragility. In every beginning since, we have reshaped ourselves in that same clay. The story never truly changed. Only its language did. He pauses, setting down the pen. His hand aches faintly, but his heart feels light. The silence around him is full of presence, the kind of quiet that carries meaning rather than absence. He rises and steps outside, letting the door fall open behind him. The corridor is dim, lit only by the moon spilling through narrow slits in the wall. Each shaft of light catches dust, making it shimmer like constellations suspended in slow motion. He moves toward the cloister garden. The night air is cool, tasting faintly of mint and rain. The fountain's steady murmur greets him again. He walks to its edge and sits on the stone rim, watching the moon's reflection tremble with every ripple. Somewhere above, a bat flits through the air, tracing invisible geometry between arches. He smiles softly. Even in darkness, life finds its map. He speaks aloud, though no one is there to hear. The myths were never lies. They were maps drawn in metaphor. We mistake them for destinations when they are directions. The sound of his voice startles a bird from the fig tree. Its wings flash pale against the night. He follows it with his eyes until it disappears into the forest, a brief streak of living silver. He lowers his head, feeling the fatigue of years settle into his bones. The journey from clay to scripture, from temple to monastery, has carried him through the span of human yearning. Yet now, in the hush of this closing hour, he senses that yearning dissolve into gratitude. He thinks of Adamu moulded by God's hands, of Eve breathing in the garden's scent, of Noah watching sunlight return on the flood's calm surface, of the Templars guarding their bridges of steel and silence, of the monks tending gardens where myth still blooms among herbs. They are all one story, one breath looping endlessly through history. The wind moves again, soft as a sigh, and carries with it the faint toll of a distant bell, perhaps from another village, perhaps only memory. Its sound fades into the night, leaving the valley wrapped in stillness. He closes his eyes and lets the rhythm of the fountain and his heartbeat merge. The candle in his room will soon gutter out, but its light has already joined the moon's, indistinguishable. He whispers, barely audible. The bridge holds. The phrase drifts upward, mingling with the cool air. Above, clouds pass slowly, veiling the moon until the world dim to silver grey. The stars emerge, small, sharp, and infinite. He remembers the Templar motto carved into the chalice in the vault. Sapiens dominabitur astris, the wise shall rule the stars. Perhaps the inscription never meant dominion, but understanding, not to conquer the heavens, but to mirror their patience. He rises at last. The night feels lighter than before, the fog almost translucent. As he walks back toward the monastery door, the stones beneath his feet hold the warmth of the day now fading. Each step sounds like punctuation at the end of a long, patient sentence. When he reaches his cell, he pauses once more at the threshold. Inside, the candle has burned to a pool of wax, its last ember still glowing faintly. He watches it flicker, falter, and vanish, leaving only the moonlight to take its place. He closes the notebook, places it on the desk, and lies down. Through the open window, the wind carries the scent of the forest and the faint rhythm of the river. He listens until sound becomes heartbeat, and heartbeat becomes breath, and breath becomes the quiet pulse of the earth itself. The bridge no longer feels external. It lives within him now, stretching across sleep, across memory, across everything that waits beyond knowing. The night deepens one final shade. The mist folds gently over the garden, softening every edge. In the fountain's mirror, the moon dissolves into ripples and then into darkness. The world exhales, slow and certain, as though resting after a long song. And with that exhale, he drifts into sleep, his thoughts still tracing the arc of a bridge that spans from the first spark of myth to the last whisper of dawn, eternal, unbroken, humming softly beneath the quiet breath of stars.